Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 38th meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee for 2024. Our first item of business this morning is a decision on taking items 4, 5 and 6 in private. Item 4 is the consideration of the evidence we've heard on proposed regulations on environmental authorisations. Item 5 is the consideration of the evidence we've heard on the Land Reform Scotland Bill. And item 6 is consideration of the committee's work programme. Are we all agreed to take these items in private? We are. Thank you. Our second item of business then this morning is an evidence session on the proposed Environmental Authorisation Scotland Amendment Regulations 2025. These regulations were laid at the end of last month. The lack of prior notice was actually unfortunate. If the committee had known they were coming, we could have begun scrutiny and work on them much earlier, knowing that these are unusually important and complex and long regulations. That said, I do want to put on record my thanks to the Acting Cabinet Secretary for her prompt and positive response to the committee's request to withdraw and relay the instruments early in the new year to allow for us to carry out some additional scrutiny. It was also appreciated by stakeholders, I believe, who've now got a more reasonable time to respond to the questions we have put to them on the regulations. This session with SEPA is to hear their views on the regulations and on the resources and skills needed to ensure that they are enforced effectively. Before I welcome people to the meeting, I would just remind members that I am a farmer and a landowner, and as such do use these regulations not only to carry out activities on the farm, but also on watercourses that run through the farm. So, I want to welcome now Lynn Bunton, the Chief Operating Officer for Regulation, Business and Environment at SEPA, who is supported this morning by Scott Crawford, the Senior Manager for Compliance and Beyond Permitting, and Wendy Thornton, the Senior Manager for Compliance and Beyond for Environmental Performance. Before moving into the questions from members, Lynn, I think you're going to make a brief opening statement.
I am, thank you. So good morning. I've been introduced, so I won't repeat that, but thank you for inviting me here today to provide evidence to you on these important regulations for SEPA. It's important to say that we're responsible for the implementation of the regulations, and so we'll focus our remarks on that, and we'll leave issues of policy for you to address with our government colleagues. So the Environmental Authorisation Scotland Amendment Regulations 2025, which I will refer to as the Amendment Regulations from now on, they represent the final legislative step in what's been a 10-year journey of significant regulatory reform and modernisation since the passing of the Regulatory Reform Scotland Act in 2014. Throughout this time, we've worked collaboratively with colleagues in the Scottish Government to turn the concept of a truly integrated approach to environmental regulation into a reality. Government responsible for the legislative side and SEPA for practical implementation. So we welcome the amendment regulations as that final piece in the jigsaw to enable this genuinely transformative work to deliver. For SEPA, for businesses and, most importantly of all, for communities and for the environment. So what these regulations do is bring all 4 of our main regulatory regimes, so that's for water, for waste, for industrial pollution control and for radioactive substances, into a single regulatory framework. So it's a framework with common processes and timescales, common tiers of authorisation and common ways of engaging. It's a framework that simplifies and modernises regimes that are in many cases old, complex, bureaucratic and spread across many different pieces of legislation. It's a framework that gives a clarity about the type of authorisation needed, why and what's required to comply, making it much easier to use and more cost-effective for both SEPA and for regulated businesses. So one of the regimes, radioactive substances, has been in the framework for a few years, and we're applying our experiences from the phased approach to make sure that we're going to be ready to migrate the other three regimes for November 2025, subject to the laying of the regulations. So the regulations significantly simplify the landscape, and I think it's worth understanding that we're taking all or part of 70 pieces of legislation across wastewater and industrial pollution control, and retransposing the requirements of all or part of 14 directives in this piece of work. So this is consolidating and updating processes, and that's what accounts for much of the considerable volume of the draft regulations. The amendment regulations, they also take the opportunity to bring new activities into the framework that were previously out of scope, where there are good environmental or business reasons for doing so. Our written evidence, we provided some examples of the work that we're doing to prepare for implementation and the engagement work that we are and have been conducting with our stakeholders. And I welcome the opportunity today to talk about these in a bit more detail for you. As we've said, I'm joined by Wendy Thornton and by Scott Crawford, both of whom are involved in various elements of our implementation of these regulations. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to make an opening statement.
Thanks very much, Lynn. I in the past have come across controlled activity regulations when cleaning ditches, for example, on the farm, which requires authorisations if the ditch is over a certain level. And it's not just SEPA involved, it can be other agencies such as SNH. So could you just talk me through how this is going to simplify that tortuous process of writing in for consent, waiting for ages, and the whole process of paying for other consents that you might need to under CAR, because I'm unclear how this is going to have a benefit, and I'd like to know the benefit, please.
The requirements that are currently in the Controlled Activities Regulations are being assimilated into this new framework, and the benefits that come are that the processes that sit behind the decision-making are harmonised across all of what will be the 4 regimes. So the process that would be gone through for the kind of activity that you're talking about will remain largely unchanged. What we are doing as we bring in these regulations is we're looking at our wider transformative approach to regulation, which brings digital experiences to customers. And I can talk a bit about something that we've already brought in for private sewage treatment works, which significantly speeds up that decision-making process. And that's the approach that we plan to take across the board with all of the permissions over time to be able to, where possible, make that decision-making happen more swiftly. But I'm sure you'll understand that the conditions and the considerations that we have to apply to ensure that we are protecting the environment, they remain unchanged by the introduction of this regulatory framework.
So there'll be other agencies involved, and you're setting yourself timescales, but does that apply to the other agencies as well?
So where other agencies are involved, they will continue to have the same timeframe in place to be able to respond. What I'm talking about, where we've been able to bring forwards a much speedier process, relates to something where it doesn't involve that consultation step with any other agencies.
Okay, so no change, basically.
What we're doing is we're harmonising the processes across 4 big regulatory regimes, which are the majority of the regulatory framework that applies to protecting Scotland's environment. At a CAR level, which is Controlled Activities Regulation level, which is the example you've given me, we're bringing across the requirements as they are, and we're implementing them through the new framework.
I'm not sure I'm any clearer. Perhaps I'm being difficult this morning. I hope not. Just on the one of the things you talked about was private sewage and septic tank. Now, I seem to remember the septic tank registration process was probably the most torturous thing that I've ever done in my life. Is that going to be simplified as well, or is that going to be the basis, that system, of the new system?
So the septic tank registration process is relatively straightforward. As we digitise it, it makes the customer experience much faster. We take the human processing element out of a lot of the decision-making as we anticipate bringing our digital tools forwards. The example I gave is about small-scale private sewage treatment systems, which are slightly bigger than a septic tank registration process.
One will become easier and one was easy already, is that what you're saying?
So I would imagine the intention that as we bring forwards our improved customer experience is that everything becomes easier, everything becomes much more straightforward over time. If you think about where we've been, we've operated paper-based systems, which we've moved into an electronic environment. We're talking now about taking that digital step, excuse me, which is a much bigger step into the future, to speed up our decision-making in relation to the majority of the decisions that we make, particularly those that are of low risk to the environment.
Okay, so on digital systems, you're still struggling as an organisation to get past the 2020 hack and to get everything back online. Still doesn't work particularly easily in my mind. But and in your paper, you're saying you're creating, designing, I think, formulating new systems. And yet we're putting the regulations in force before those are in force. Are you confident it's going to digitally be a smooth transition for SEPA? Not something you've got a great record on, I would suggest, in the past, Lynn.
I might indicate that it's unfair to characterise our behaviour as the result of previous unexpected experiences. So our approach is to have available a digital system at the point at which the regulations come into effect for applications. That's our plan at the moment, and we're working hard towards making that a reality.
Okay, right. The other committee members want to ask questions, so I'll stop hogging the floor and move to Douglas Lumsden. Douglas.
Yeah, thanks, Convener, and good morning. Specifically in relation to any changes to waste licensing, did SEPA consider how any changes might support the transition to a circular economy?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah.
And can you expand a bit on that then, and how it sort of fits in together?
So the waste sector is the sector that will see the most significant changes, because the age of some of the waste sector regulations that we're assimilating into this new framework are some of the oldest, the most complex, the most bureaucratic. In terms of the circular economy principles, they underpin our thinking across the regulatory framework that we're bringing into effect.
So you're bringing in would drive us all towards a more circular economy, is that correct?
Yeah, it will support. In terms of the detail behind the policy of the regulations, I would recommend that that's a question that you ask our government colleagues. So remember, this is an assimilation of the existing regulations as they exist at the moment. Right.
Okay. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Monica, I think you've got some questions.
Yes, thank you and good morning, everyone. I wanted to ask, what are the key work streams for SEPA in transitioning to the integrated authorisation framework and associated resourcing requirements? And I wonder if you accept the assessment in the business and regulatory impact statement for the regulations that SEPA will not incur any additional costs.
So there are a number of work streams that we're working through. We have a large programme of engagement and consultation with stakeholders who will be affected by the change, who will see a change to the way that they're regulated. We have our own digital transformation work stream that we are working through in order to make our customer experience, customer journey more straightforward and more efficient and effective. We are working closely with our technical teams in developing appropriate guidance as reflects the changes to the regulatory framework. And last but not least, we are working through our own internal staff development and training. So those are the main work streams that we have in order to bring the regulations into effect as part of our implementation plan. In terms of any comments that are in the BRIA, I would refer those back to Scottish Government colleagues.
Okay, thank you. Are you able to say if the new regulations have any implications for SEPA's existing fee structure and approach to full cost recovery?
So the consultation that just closed in the last month or so considers the changes that the framework is going to make, and we'll be publishing the consultation output early in the new year and making a recommendation to the Cabinet Secretary for changes that are necessary to the charging scheme. Our charging scheme ensures that we have full cost recovery for those chargeable elements that we undertake, and that's the principle that we will continue to operate on going forwards.
Okay, thank you. Given that the Scottish Budget has recently been announced, a draft budget for 2025-26, where and your budget has remained relatively steady in that process, do you have any concerns about resourcing this new transition in the coming year, or are there any other budgetary concerns that you have?
We have implementation plans that we've been working through over the past years. We, as we always do, are engaged with our sponsor division in the Scottish Government when we're discussing the draft budget settlement that we have at the moment. The implementation of these regulations is a key outcome for us in our corporate plan, and that forms the basis for those discussions from a budget perspective.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of risk to be able to implement those plans, what would be the key risks that you could identify?
So we have a very comprehensive plan that we're working through, which assesses and mitigates any risks that we will have identified as we've planned our implementation phase. My greatest concern, if I could turn the question around that way, would be that we are not bringing the regulations forwards on the timescale, or as close to, as possible, the timescale that we are currently anticipating, that there were to be any form of avoidable delay.
Mm-hmm. And could you just expand a little bit more in terms of the impact that delay could have?
The benefit of these regulations coming into effect, I'm going to eulogise now for a bit if I'm not careful, but the benefit for us and for, as I've said, for both communities, the environment, those that we regulate, is something that is significant in terms of the position that as an environmental regulator SEPA has been in since 1999, which is when we were 1996, which is when we were first formed. The opportunity that is presented by these regulations in terms of harmonising processes, and it might not sound like a significant step change, but the detail of some of the challenges that we faced as a regulator because of the way that the patchwork, the network of regulations have been constructed, it's difficult to comprehend unless you're working within the system, the challenges that the current position can present to us, that will be removed as we bring the new integrated framework forward across those 4 major regimes. Now, they are only 4 of the big regimes that we deal with. I've talked about 70 statutory instruments that we're bringing together here. We have something like 150 plus statutory instruments that we draw duties and powers from as an organisation. This is a big deal. These are the biggest activities. So it's important to us that we're able to gain the efficiencies and effectiveness that these regulations will bring so that we can do that job of protecting the environment better in future.
Thank you, that's helpful. And just a final question for now. I understand that SEPA may be changing the way the out-of-hours contact centre operates to a more automated system. I'm not sure if that's entirely correct, so you can correct me if I've got that wrong. But if that is the case, what assessment has been made on the impact of this change on transitioning to the new framework we've just discussed?
So the services that the 24/7 contact centre that we have had historically will continue in the new arrangements, and the ability for the public, for those that we regulate, for emergency services to make contact with us over that period, where a civil contingencies category 1 responder continue. So the provisions to make sure that we have that contact available will still be in place as we move forward and modernise the approach that we have with our new, I think it's a customer hub is the terminology that we use. So we retain the ability to do what we were able to do in future.
Okay, and when does that come into effect, that change, the customer hub?
We're in the midst of it at this moment in time. We're going through the transition at this point in time.
Thank you.
Mark, you wanted to come in, I think, briefly there.
Yeah, morning. A couple of years ago, your previous chief executive talked quite openly about SEPA focusing its activities on those big sectors that were not meeting environmental compliance. And I think, you know, salmon farming was a focus at that time. I think Moss Moran at that time was a focus. And that's where a lot of SEPA's resources were going. And he also talked about then streamlining the regulatory process for those sectors that were broadly compliant and where a lack of compliance was a rarity. Is that part of that? Is that, I know he's gone now. He's been gone for some time, but is that the current direction of SEPA then, in terms of simplifying regulation at one end, but then focusing in on key sectors that are still problematic at the other end, or are we looking at a slightly different approach now? I'm just trying to see where this sits within where you are now, several years on, what the current environmental challenges we have in Scotland and how you really focus resources on those.
So the direction of travel that we're on with the integrated framework, we've been on for during that period that you're talking about, Mark. So there is a continuum, I suppose, in terms of our thinking. I can't speak to the evidence that was provided before, but if you should have available to you the written evidence that we provided the committee in advance, and at the back of it, it sets out the authorisation, the types of authorisation pyramid. And that's really important because that's based on an assessment of risk to the environment and the kinds of conditions that need to apply to different types of activities. So one could say it doesn't matter what sector you're in, it will be the risk that you pose to the environment because of the inherent characteristics of your activity that will fit you into a particular area within that pyramid. But we know that there are, and there are examples given, I think, that there are some common behaviour, common characteristics of certain activities which, for, I think it's mobile crushers, if I remember rightly, has allowed us to consider that actually they can be dropped down the hierarchy of permissions that we've put in place. So we operate, we're an intelligence or an evidence-led organisation, we operate on the basis of environmental risk. I would not use the blanket of sectors at this moment in time to describe how we approach the way that we authorise through the integrated authorisation framework. I hope that helps.
Yeah, but in terms of compliance, are there particular sectors that stand out at the moment?
One of the pieces of work that we are moving forwards on as a result of the past few years is developing an environmental performance assessment scheme, and that's something we intend to consult on next year. So that's out with the scope of the evidence that we're here to talk about. But that will give us the ability to report on holistically the environmental performance of all of those that we regulate. At this moment in time, we have our site-by-site compliance information, and that then drives how we focus on each individual activity that we regulate.
And is that then transparent for members of the public who want to get a grasp on which sectors are problematic or which sites are problematic? We're talking about point source pollution. How will they interface with all of this?
So the bringing forwards of an environmental performance assessment scheme, which will be subject to consultation next year, will reintroduce that transparency for everyone. Okay.
That's long awaited, I think. Yeah. Okay.
Mr Lumsden, I think you want to question as it's Christmas, I'll let you in.
All right, thank you very much. It's just a follow-up to Monica Lennon's question about the changes to the call centre. And with all these changes, I just want to know so what changes have been made to the call centre just now? Has it all went automated, and when did it go live?
So I think it would be helpful, perhaps, if we provided information to the committee separate to the evidence that I'm able to give you today about the integrated authorisation framework. You're moving into an area which is out with the scope of the regulatory change.
Go live on the 8th of December?
We're in the process of transitioning. I've provided that answer already.
So do you not know?
We're in the process of transitioning.
Thanks, Kavina.
I think, Lynn, it would be helpful if you provided a briefing with the dates so we can understand them. Just before we move on to the next question, which will come from Kevin, there was a question that Monica asked on feeing and on the basis of raising fees on a full recovery basis. Where there are other agencies involved, will you be the central feeing point for them as well? So if SNH has to come in to give consent, if Scottish Water have to come in and give consent, will they be raising a fee, putting it to you, and will you be putting that as part of the licence fee?
So the consenting process, we cost recover for our own activities. Where other organisations are licensing, they will cost recover for their activities. I think the area where we often have input from other organisations is in the form of consultees, so statutory consultees to provide advice to us, and likewise we provide advice to the planning system. Those are not cost recovered by SEPA on the part of other organisations.
Are you predicting big fee increases for some of the activities?
So our consultation, which closed in November, did not. No. Just checking, did not, and we will be publishing the results of that consultation early next year and going through the process. So this is an amalgamation. Again, the integrated authorisation framework is an amalgamation of those 4 schemes. So it is broadly continuing with the same fee structure that we have at the moment, with those additional activities and the subtle changes in certain areas having been consulted upon last year, and we're going through the due process of ensuring that we get sign-off for those changes.
So would it be fair to say, or am I putting words into your mouth, that they won't increase by greater than RPI? Those
would be matters that I would prefer to take off table, and we can provide you with a written update on the consultation response. I'm not in a position to confirm that because the decision making is subject to a decision that we recommend to the Cabinet Secretary. Okay, we look forward to seeing that as well. Kevin, over to you.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. I want to look at the fit and proper person test. So, first of all, can you explain how the fit and proper person test will be applied to the new framework and how that is expected to support more robust environmental regulation?
So the fit and proper person test was a kind of once and done for certain types of application historically. The introduction through this new framework to it across the broadest of activities makes a significant difference in our ability to consider the abilities of an authorisation holder on an ongoing basis. Historically, for some of the regimes, the extent to which we were able to go was to make a judgment about whether an applicant would be able to comply with the conditions. And in the waste regime in specific areas, there was a requirement to ensure that there were no relevant convictions, that there was financial provision in place, as well as that technical competence to deliver in particular areas. The new framework expands out our consideration of fit and proper person test. And I'm going to bring my colleague Wendy in to add a little bit more detail to be able to put some context around about that for you. You're okay now.
I'm okay, thank you. Right, thank you. I think Lynn's covered most of the key changes to the fit and proper person test and an important one is that you have to maintain your fit and properness over the lifetime of the authorisation. The fit and proper person test currently only applies to waste activities, and it's a test we can only apply at the application stage. So, for example, if we require an operator to have financial provision for site remediation at the end of the life of the site, there's nothing there that requires them to maintain that financial provision. They can have the money in the bank at the application point, but that money might not be there at the end of the life of the activity when it's needed for remediation. So that's a really important change in making the fit and proper person test something that maintains compliance and protects the environment. We've also got some additional things we can take into account when we consider fit and proper person, and we can take a wider range of convictions into account now, which we think is really important to help us tackle waste crime. And we can also take things that we haven't been able to take account in the past. So, for example, if somebody's got a history of forming and dissolving companies to avoid their environmental liabilities, and we can see that as a pattern over time. We can take that into account in our decision around, is that a suitable person to give an environmental authorisation to in the first place? So it's a really important improvement for us, because making sure you only give an authorisation to the right person in the first place avoids a lot of enforcement problems further down the road when they prove not to be the right sort of person to hold an authorisation. And the other big change is that fit and proper person only applies currently to waste activities, but we will have the ability to apply that test across all our activities, although we're still thinking about how we'll do that in future. And we are planning to consult on some changes to our guidance around fit and proper person, which was published in 2018 in January this year. Next year, sorry.
Okay. Obviously, this applies to the new framework. What about current permit holders? Where do they lie in all of this in terms of the change?
So the new test will apply to current permit holders, but we're not planning to retrospectively go around and assess every existing authorisation holder against the new fit and proper person test, but it will be something we'll be able to take into account as part of our routine compliance work.
Can I ask why you won't go back and look at current permit holders when you said earlier on that throughout the lifetime you were going to continue to check on whether or not a person was fit and proper?
Because most permit holders currently are compliant. So this ties in with the work that Lynn was describing about our environmental performance assessment scheme. So we'll target those assessments on where we consider that non-compliance is perhaps due to fit and proper persons.
I understand the targeting aspect of this, but you said earlier that all of this new change will ensure that throughout the lifetime of the permission that you will be checking to see if somebody is fit and proper. Why would you not go back, obviously targeting those who are non-compliant first, but why would you not go back and look at current permit holders as well if you intend that change for that continuous look and at whether or not somebody's fit and proper under the new regime?
There's a couple of reasons. One, as Wendy has said, most of the activities that we regulate are compliant, and we're able to use it as an extra, as additional requirements that an operator has to comply with as part of that consideration. Now, we need to focus our resources, which are not unlimited and are very precious, absolutely, on the areas where we have known issues. So we're able to use it as a tool in that regard. What we're not doing is going back and running through the assessment element of fit and proper person as a decision-making tool, because we use it to decide whether someone is able to have a permission granted to them or not. Now, we're not in the business of taking permissions away from people unless there are very good environmental reasons to do so. This tool allows us to use other criteria to consider. Are there other reasons, are there other signals that we can use around about the behaviours of those who are holding permits? So, for example, other types of convictions, whether they are exposing SEPA staff and other public servants to violence and behaviours that would be characterised as violence and aggression. That then influences how we might then consider our compliance activity, and we have available to us the same tools that we have at the moment to consider whether we remove a permission from someone which heavily relies on their environmental, if not wholly, their environmental impact. So it's a bit about making sure that we are fairly and equitably considering new material as we transition into this new regime. There's no guillotine that comes down. The way that SEPA operates its enforcement policy, our enforcement policy, is something which is a continuum of activities that we apply, from offering advice and guidance to correct behaviours, to adjust behaviours to ensure compliance, to that hard-nosed edge where we can directly fine through variable and fixed monetary penalties, or we can make a report to the Crown Office, to COPFIS rather, in order to seek a prosecution if an offence is so significant. This falls into that consideration of the environmental behaviour for us. Rather than taking a a step of going back and reviewing every single permission that we have in place. That doesn't, it's not an efficient or effective way for us to use that new power, but to bring it in as we are going through compliance work.
Let me be helpful here, because one of the things which I'm quite sure that you don't want to see, and certainly the public wouldn't want to see, is two regimes, basically. Those folks that have received permission under the new framework and those folks with the existing permits. That would be fair to say, would it not?
So there will always be a transition.
I get the transition point.
Yeah.
I get the transition point. But what you don't want to see, as you progress, that they're being even seen to be two regimes. Would that be fair to say?
We will move across as we... So if an operator were to come to us and ask and seek to vary their licence, that's an opportunity for us to reconsider their status as a fit and proper person for a particular activity. So I think, what I think you're trying to get at is there are going to be dual standards here. And we're applying consistently the fit and proper person test. We apply it at the application phase and then we consider it through the life of every activity that's had it applied at the application stage, and for anything that hasn't, we consider it through the life of an activity anyway.
I think that's a very easy question, but I think you're complicating the answer, to be honest with you. Because the simple question is, I get the transition and all of the rest of it, but this will not lead to two regimes where those folks applying under the new framework are under a different regime from those folks who have got current permits. You will transition to ensure that everybody is deemed to be a fit and proper person.
Over time, yes, because that will form...
Simple answer, right? Sorry,
Kevin, I'm sure you want to know the time frame that she's talking, that's being talked about.
I'm going to come to all of this, Convener. So, as the Convener has just asked, I'll move to that question first. Okay. What are the timeframes in terms of those changes so that we have, that transition complete and one regime?
So the regime will come in as of currently planned 1st of November. For some elements 1st of June. But for the majority of the elements that we're bringing in 1st of November, and then there are transition dates further through the following 3 years, I think it is, 3 or 4 years. So as of the point at which all of the authorisations that are currently in effect are deemed, which will be the 1st of November 2025, yes, at that point we are able to apply those fit and proper considerations to our compliance work.
Okay. One of the things which I'm most interested in, and I think that the general public are interested in, is around about complaints. If there are complaints, would you then look and apply the fit and proper person test to ensure, that there has been nothing that has gone askew since the application or since a previous look at the fit and proper person test? And beyond that, is there court notifications if folks with permits fall foul of the law in one way, shape or form?
So, yes, if we receive complaints, and I take that in its widest sense, so it could be... Or perhaps I could ask you just to elaborate about the type... Are you talking about environmental concerns that are raised with us?
Well, it may well be, that somebody comes to you with environmental concerns. It may well be that somebody comes to you saying that there may be a financial problem with a permit holder. It could be a number of things. How do you deal with these things?
So we look for evidence. We look for evidence and identify if there's an issue, and we follow our enforcement policy in addressing that issue if we have identified that there's evidence to support it. In terms of court notification, I don't think there's anything specific to fit and proper person test. That's a regulatory decision for us, but it would be a factor in our considerations. And if there was evidence that our enforcement policy supported us taking forwards, we would use it in that way. And so it might factor into a decision that we make about whether there is a requirement for a notice to adjust the behaviour of someone who holds a licence, or any other kind of enforcement activity that we undertake. So I think that answers the second part of your question as well.
Okay. At the very beginning of all of this, you talked about simplification and modernisation in terms of the regulations themselves. In some regards, some of the evidence today doesn't sound like simplification. In fact, some of what you have said sounds a bit complicated, to say the least. In all of this, in terms of getting across the simplification, or the supposed simplification, what's the communication strategy from SEPA's point of view once these regulations come into play, if Parliament passes them, to ensure, the messaging to the general public in particular is simplified?
So I'm sorry to hear that it's coming across that this is a more complex situation. That's certainly not our expectation or the design intent behind the regulations, or certainly our implementation plan for the regulations. Our consultation and engagement exercises started some time ago, and the feedback that we have from those that we've consulted with, which is many and varied, including either individual bodies, other third-party stakeholders and trade bodies, is very supportive of the changes that we're proposing to make here. I'm going to ask Scott to provide a bit more detail about the consultation and engagement processes that we've done, the way we've gone about it and what we have planned, if that's okay. Yeah.
Yep. So in the past year alone, we've done 3 public consultations. We ran stakeholder events for the first one, which was in the type of authorisation that regulated business would require under the amended regulations. We did that in collaboration with Scottish Government, who were, at that time, were consulting on the draft regulations. And since then, we've done 2 further public consultations, one on changes to the charging scheme that we've already mentioned, and also standard conditions that would apply to the registration tier. So overall, we had 160 stakeholders coming along to those events. We received quite a lot of feedback from that, and we did further engagement with those that raised any concerns, and we made some changes on the back of that. In terms of going forward, we have got another consultation that's going to go live in the beginning of the year.
Because my question wasn't about consultation, and I get all of the consultation that's been going on. My question was about communication. How are you going to communicate to the public around about these changes if Parliament passes this framework? Because I come back to the point that was made earlier, that this is about simplification. Now, myself, other colleagues around this table, when we have constituents coming to us, they talk about the complication of dealing with SEPA. How do we get across in simple terms, because it was you that talked about simplification, how do we get across in simple terms a comm strategy about these changes so that it's meaningful not only to the stakeholders who know a lot more, but the public in general who often feel that they are not listened to in all of this?
Yeah, so so we have got a transition plan that we've built up and we are developing. So one of the things we're doing is we are doing a complete review of a lot of our guidance that's going to apply to that. So we're developing new guidance, what types of authorisation people need, in very simple terms, how much it's going to cost them. That is going on our website, which we're doing a review of the content. We've done external usability testing with people from outside the organisation to see how the web pages would look. And that has been overall very, very positive. And we have a comm strategy in terms of campaigns, social media, highlighting those stakeholders and members of the public that it's going to change, it's going to affect most and be able to do some targeted communications around them.
Okay. Thank you, Convener.
Thanks for that. I'm now going to move to the Deputy Convener, Michael Matheson. Michael.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. Can I turn to the issue of the call-in procedure and the new pre-application process that is envisaged with these new regulations? Can I get your view on how you feel the existing call-in procedure for CAR has operated, and what you think in the existing procedure has not worked well, which is why it needs to change?
Call-in procedure, from the perspective of SEPA, is a process that we follow, I think, in terms of how it's worked, because that is a process that the Scottish Government follow. I would recommend that they're able to provide their view on how effective that process has been. We follow the processes as they are set out.
Yeah, but can I ask you your opinion on how they've operated?
In terms of opinion, we follow the process as it's set out.
You don't have an opinion on whether the process operates well or not?
Is
that a serious answer?
So, it's a process that has applied only to CAR. It's a process that was brought in 10 or so years ago, and has applied to a very small number of the applications that, across the whole range we're talking about here in terms of the integrated framework, we consider on an annual basis. It's not an area where I have an opinion. Okay, so you don't have an opinion on the procedure for call-in. So the consultation document then, okay, from the consultation states that the existing system, practical experience under the procedure, it rarely results in changes to outcome, and it often results in delays, resulting with very little change. Is that an accurate reflection of your experience as a regulator of how the call-in procedure under CAR operates? If those are the facts that have been provided by the Scottish Government, I have nothing else to add to that. Well, I'm asking you specifically, is that your experience of the process? I'm not asking you for your opinion, I'm asking you for as a fact. Is that your experience or not? So my apologies, Deputy Convener. I don't think I can answer that question, because that's beyond the scope of the work that SEPA undertakes. So we await a response when a call-in, third-party call-in has been made, and we act on it when we receive it. So, as the regulator, you have got no view on whether the call-in procedure operates well, or whether what's set out here in this document is correct or not. You've got no idea, as the regulator. It's not that we have no idea, it's that we follow the process as set. It is an element of the decision-making that we follow through, and the timing. So the key issue from my perspective is we pause our determination until we have a response when a call-in has been triggered, and then we restart our determination. It's a process, it's a due process that we follow. Yeah, I'm not really asking you about the due process that you presently follow as regulator. The claim in the consultation and the need for the change here is on the basis that the existing procedures result in delay, rarely result in changes of outcome, and is of limited utility. That's a direct quote from the consultation document and the findings of the review. Does that match your experience as the regulator that's responsible for implementing the call-in procedure? I find it quite hard to believe that as the regulator you don't have a view on your experience in using the call-in procedure. Well, it's quite a simple question. It's not a trick. I'm asking you just to be very clear.
Is what's reflected in the document an accurate reflection of your experience?
So what's reflected in the document is the Scottish Government's experience. So yes, what happens when an application is called in, there is an extra piece of time that appears in that determination window from the point at which the applicant has made their application to the point at which we are then able to move forward and determine something. I think the point that's being made in the evidence that the Scottish Government has provided to the committee is that they are stating to you that there is very rarely a change, if ever, to the decision that has been proposed. So we will follow the due process as it's set out. Would I prefer that we could move forwards as swiftly as possible? I do, but the call-in procedure is part of that at the moment. So that's something that we factor into our determination period. It's just a fact of life with the decision-making that we have at the moment.
Okay. Right. I don't know if that gives me much to go on in it, but I'll just put on the record, I actually find it really surprising as a regulator you're not able to confirm whether the details set out in the document and the consultation is correct or not. But I'll let you take that away and you can reflect on that as a regulator, but I don't think it reflects well on you. Can I turn to the second issue, and that's about the pre-application community engagement element of it? You'll be required now, of course, to put a public participation statement in place, given the discretionary nature of what will now operate around some of the call-in procedures. How do you intend to take that forward in terms of developing your public participation statement, and what's the timeline for it being developed?
Is that consultation coming soon? Yeah. So I can confirm that we're consulting on our proposed approach to this in January next year, which will give stakeholders in the public an opportunity to provide their responses to our proposal.
Okay. And how long will that consultation last for, and when will the finalised document be published?
So our normal consultation window is best practice is 12 weeks. So that would be from January to some time thereafter, 12 weeks thereafter. It takes a period of time, as you'll understand, to distill consultation responses, and then we move to publish that consultation response and set out our proposal as a result of any feedback that we've received.
Okay, so what's the end point for when you expect it to be published?
I would anticipate that we will have it done in advance of the 1st of November 2025.
So how far in advance?
You're asking me to anticipate how long it will take. You're asking me to anticipate how many consultation responses we receive and how complicated they will be. I would hazard a guess that it might take us 6 months from January to do that, on the basis of some significant unknowns at this moment in time.
Okay, thank you very much. Hand back to you, Convener.
Thank you, Michael. Monica, I think you've got the next question.
Thank you, Convener. Yeah, I want to turn to sewage sludge. Are you able to summarise what the key regulatory changes are for sewage sludge as a result of it being brought into the integrated authorisation framework, and what environmental issues this aims to address?
So it follows on from a public petition to the Parliament regarding odour impacts on communities. So that's the starting point for it. And what the Environmental Authorisation Scotland regulations brings in here is whole supply chain control by one organisation for the first time. So SEPA will authorise all of the steps in relation to production, transport, storage and use of sewage sludge as is currently proposed from the 1st of June. It's also going to be subject to the fit and proper person test that we talked about before. And one of the big steps here is that the fit and proper person test will apply to those transporting sewage sludge as well. And that's an enhancement that's provided by the integrated authorisation, or the framework that we're talking, the amended regulations. That, I think, is quite a significant step forwards, the fact that we can bring that tool to bear, that future tool to bear, and that we are the single regulator, so a single point of contact for all of those who may have concerns or may be interested in this particular activity taking place. And we're working with the major producers, Scottish Water being the biggest, and others to implement the regulations. So I think those are the significant changes that I would highlight to the committee today.
Thank you for that. Part of the public concern about sewage sludge is whether we know enough about the impact of microplastics and forever chemicals getting into the environment and food chain. Do you accept the recent ESS recommendations, Environmental Standards Scotland, that more research is required on this? And will these regulations support this through improved monitoring and soil sampling?
So we certainly are looking to review the availability and the processes around about monitoring for the substances that you've mentioned. And I'm aware that the James Hutton Institute produced a report earlier on this week. We haven't had an opportunity to fully consider the content of that report yet. It is in this area, it is a work in progress.
Okay, that's helpful, thank you. And one of the changes that's been made between the draft and the final regulations is that the default requirement to monitor nitrogen in the soil has been removed. Are you aware of the background to this change, and what impact will this have on the robustness of the regime for sewage sludge?
So that is a specific for the Scottish Government, I'm afraid, in terms of considering what was included following the consultation in the regulations. So if I could maybe ask you to raise that with them.
Yeah, happy to do so. Just on that point about nitrogen in the soil, is there anything that you can advise the committee on? No. Okay, no problem.
Sorry, can I just push you, sorry, Monica, to jump in? You're laying the blame of that. Oh, sorry. You're laying that on the Scottish Government. Did you have a view? Did you give the view to the Scottish Government whether it should be included or not?
So we have worked very closely with the Government, as I said earlier on, in developing this. On that particular, I'm not sure. I think we don't have the information in the room, and that would be information that I would ask if the committee would like to hear from us. We can provide it separately.
Well, I think we'd like to follow up to find out why it was dropped. I mean, you've said you've blamed, or you've laid it at the door of the Scottish Government. If we don't know why it's at their door, when we come to ask them the question, we can't ask the right, or Monica can't ask the right question. Sorry, Monica, to jump in.
Yeah, I didn't want to be pushy if we don't have the information at hand, but I think that commitment to write to us, and we can take up with the Government if it's still not clear, because it feels like it might be a not insignificant change.
I'm just trying to make sure that we are responsible for implementation and enforcement decisions about what's been included in the regulations. While we have been involved in that development process, they are decisions matters for the Scottish Government.
Yeah, no, I think the committee understands the distinction, but in terms of that close working relationship between SEPA as regulator and the Scottish Government, it's clear there's obviously been discussion and dialogue and input. So, you know, as much of that can be in the public domain is helpful for us to understand why certain decisions have been made. Okay, just the final question I had on sewage sludge, convener, is just to try and understand to what extent the provisions are in line with existing EU law, and if there's any divergence that you're aware of.
So we're aware, I believe, that there are developments happening in Europe that have not yet come to fruition. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that those will be considered in terms of EU parity as well, I suspect, in due course. Wendy, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I was just going to add that the regulations are in alignment with current existing EU law. But Acton says...
So I didn't fully catch that, Wendy. At the moment, it's...
The regulations are aligned with current EU law.
Okay,
and then Lynn's mentioning that there's some amendments that we know aware of in the pipeline.
So there could be further change. Okay. We may have to take that into account. Okay, I'll just leave it there, convener.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Monica. Douglas, I think you've got a brief question.
I was going to move on to carbon capture, utilisation and storage, Convener.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. That's what I was expecting. Sorry.
Yeah, good. Obviously, in terms of CCUS, your scope would be broadening. So, do you know whether there's much activity in the sort of broader area that you'd then be covering? Because I presume, in terms of Acorn project and Peterhead Power Station, you're fully involved in that.
Yep.
So, what else would you be involved in that you're aware of?
So this is an evolving area. I don't have any specific projects that are, for example, shovel ready at the moment that I can talk to in this area. But one of the things that's often welcomed by a sector is to have clarity about what the regulatory framework that will apply to them is as they're starting to develop their projects. That's what this amendment does. It takes us from a country that has limited controls over activities that are happening on the same site, and it expands them out to make sure that we've got the appropriate environmental protection coming forwards for any technologies that apply to carbon capture, utilisation and storage.
Expertise to deal with that just now, or is that something you would have to go out and get?
So we develop our own, we grow our own, and it will depend very much on the types of technologies that are brought forward. So we have experience and knowledge around about chemical separation, for example. That's one of the potential carbon capture and storage techniques. There may be other areas where we have to draw on expertise if we don't have it in-house. We have sister agencies across the rest of the UK and good relationships with them and other regulators where we're able to cross-fertilise our experiences.
Something that you anticipate causing you a problem then?
I don't anticipate it causing a problem.
Okay.
Correct.
Thanks, Convener.
Thanks. Mark, your turn.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about these regulations and the conversations that I presume that you've been having with Environmental Standards Scotland. So, if we go back to the point that the Deputy Convener was making about call-in procedures, that's something that you don't really have a view on, it appears, this morning, about their efficacy or not. Is that something that ESS have a view on, that have they communicated that to you?
I'm not aware of ESS sharing that view directly with us. Again, they may have provided a response to the Scottish Government's consultation. I think that would be my best assessment of where that information might sit.
Okay. So in terms of the development of these regulations, has there been any discussion with ESS? Or is it about SEPA and ESS communicating directly with government and not with you?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question. Sorry, Mark, I'm not sure I understand the question.
ESS are your regulator.
Yes.
They regulate you.
They are.
They assess whether you are enforcing regulations appropriately. They also advise as to whether the law is appropriate, whether regulations need to be changed, whether regimes need to be amended, and about their compliance with EU legislation. That's my understanding. That's your understanding, yeah?
Broadly, yes.
Okay. So what has the conversation been between yourselves and ESS in relation to these regulations?
So we have many interactions with ESS over a range of subjects. I'm not in a position to give you any specifics around about our interactions with ESS on this particular topic. And again, if that was information that the committee would find useful, I can come back with a response.
Presumably I could FOI that and you would eventually provide me with the information if I really
think
want.
it would probably be something that if the committee was interested in, we'd provide directly to you without the need for an FOI.
I think we would, because obviously we'll be inviting ESS into this committee in the weeks ahead. And the interaction between yourselves, ESS and the government is an area of interest.
I think it's worth, forgive me for interrupting, again, the regulations are for the Scottish Government, and the Scottish Government has consulted on them. So in terms of formal interaction, ESS, I believe, have provided a response to the Scottish Government's consultation on these regulations. I can't speak definitively as to whether they've given us formal responses to the many consultations we've been undertaking on the implementation side, and nor can I speak at the moment to our informal interactions with them when we have regular update discussions with them on particular issues.
If you're able to summarise, then, to avoid me putting in an FOI, if you're able to summarise what that engagement has looked like, and if it has covered any of the issues we've talked about this morning, including the issue that the Deputy Convener raised around call-in procedures, that would be useful, because we're trying to understand where the advice sits and how government responds both to ESS and to any views that you may or may not have. I'd like to turn to a final issue, and that's around ammonia. So my understanding is that over the last 30 years, ammonia emissions have barely dropped. In fact, there's some evidence that suggests that they've increased. And as we know, ammonia causes public health issues and environmental problems as well. So do you see that as a failure of regulation?
So certain ammonia sources are covered by regulation. For example, intensive agriculture installations. But not all of those known sources are covered by regulation. So it may well be that you could characterise it as a gap.
Okay, so it is a gap in relation to these regulations, isn't it?
Yeah, so I go back to my description at the beginning of what this framework is. It's the amalgamation and the consolidation of 4 existing big pieces of legislation. It has introduced 1 or 2 additional elements. We've talked about a couple of them already. In relation to ammonia, the government has chosen not to include it, and I would suggest that, again, that would be a question for government colleagues as to why that were the case.
Okay, but you are a science-based organisation, so as scientists, what does that tell you about ammonia levels? If ammonia levels are going up, would you see that as a failure of regulation?
As a science and an evidence-based organisation, I'm not in a position to give you a scientific or an evidence-based answer to the question at this moment in time, but I would like to, again, that may be something we can follow up with after the committee.
I think that would be very welcome. I mean, let me look at it from the perspective of a constituent then. Let's say I've got a constituent who lives, close to a dairy farm. Members of that family have particular lung health conditions that are exacerbated by particulates that are derived from ammonia. They're looking for regulation. They're looking for answers to the problems. They're looking for action to be taken by the polluter. If they phone up your helpline, what information would you give them? Where do they sit within this authorisation framework?
So the framework is bringing in the application of material to land, including sewage sludge, and that introduces a regulatory framework around about controls in that area. At this moment in time, I'm racking my brains that there is no additional provision that relates to dairy farming within the regulations.
So not covered by permit, not covered by registration, not covered by notification, and not covered by general binding rules.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Not the activity of dairy farming per se.
Okay. So let's go back to the conversation with a constituent then. A constituent phones your helpline. They want answers, they want action. What action can you take?
So in relation to, in the future state, in relation to the impacts that they're experiencing from sewage sludge applied to land, we will have some considerations that we can make in relation to dairy farming. I'm not talking about
sewage sludge because 92% of ammonia comes from agriculture. So I'm not talking about human sewage. I'm talking about application of slurry, inappropriate management of slurry wastes within a facility, which is resulting in increased ammonia. So let's focus it on where 92% of the problem is in relation to ammonia. Okay. What actions do you take?
So I'm perhaps being a bit slow in picking up the impact on the environment that you're raising here.
Is that your response if I phoned you up? I'm talking about a health issue here. So somebody has an environmental nuisance. There might be odour issues. There might be a health impact in terms of lung health caused by PM2.5 that's derived from ammonia. What action? I'm on hold here. What action can you take? What regulatory tools do you have available to take action?
In the event that someone contacts us about something, we seek evidence to try and identify the source of it, the problem. We look at the regulatory framework, we identify the action that we can take. The integrated authorisation framework that we're talking about, that we are bringing in, contains certain controls that we can bring to bear. There will be consideration in future for activities that are not currently included within it. So, for example, in terms of, and this is not the answer I would give somebody on the phone because I don't have that skill set, but the activity that we're talking about here is something that I know the EU is considering under IED2, and I imagine that where the Scottish Government consider that in future the regulatory framework needed to be amended or expanded, that would be the route by which those controls were brought in.
Right. So basically, my constituent is going to have to wait until a European directive is considered and concluded in 2026, and then there might be a consultation with the Scottish Government about whether they want to implement any of those provisions within domestic law. There's no recourse to environmental justice in the short term for somebody that is living next to a dairy farmer point source emission of ammonia and has concerns and has real health impacts because it's not covered by general binding rules, notification, registration or a permit. For
dairy farming per se, that's
okay.
My understanding.
Would you say then that that's a gap?
Because simply as it doesn't exist in the regulations, it is a gap.
Okay. And do you feel that there are other approaches?
Sorry, I've given you a fairly good run at this. Bob wants to come in. We are quite short of time. Could I ask you to make this your last question?
Just one more, and I thank you for responding. It is a difficult issue, given that there is a gap here. But can I just ask you, is there anything then that SEPA is able to do, given your limited resources, which I acknowledge, in this space around promoting good practice with the farming sector in this area? And would that be in any way effective to dealing with the kind of issues that I've just raised with you?
So we do work very closely with the farming sector in relation to impacts on the water environment. I need to correct something I said a moment ago, if I can, Convener. IED2 does not include dairy farming. I've just been advised. I think it's a gap in IED2, so I hope I'm okay to correct the record in that way. So we with other regulators, because there is a landscape of regulators who work with the agricultural industry, will be working with them in our various different statutory roles in order to ensure best practice is delivered. As a regulator, we must operate within the rules that are set. We're a delivery agent for government in this regard. In fact, we're a delivery agent for government in every regard and operate within the frameworks that are set for us.
Okay, I think that's pretty clear from your evidence this morning. So.
Thanks, Mark. Bob, can I ask you to very briefly ask your question?
It's going to be incredibly brief because I wasn't intending asking any questions this morning, but just to listen. But I think I really need to know more generally as a regulator, because much of your answers has been relating to saying this is the operational matters and here's the facts of the matter in terms of operational matters and not straying into policy matters. But I think the Deputy Premier had quite an extensive exchange with you, and I think members were trying to tease out how your operational experience then informs government as to how they might change their policy as a consequence of SEPA's operational experience. And members were trying to get some of that contrast. I don't think we've ever seen such a kind of passive position from a regulator at committee. And I went and looked at the consultation responses in relation to the changes to calling procedures, and a majority were in favour of it, a substantial minority were not in favour of it. There was a finely balanced decision for government to make. SEPA must surely have had a role in some of that, but I don't think we're any the wiser in relation to what SEPA's role was in relation to any of that. So can I ask more generally in relation to these regulations, What has the role of SEPA been? Because after this evidence session, I'm completely unclear.
So let me think about how to give you some more information to help with that question. We are very involved in technical matters to do with future regulation, current regulation, and this will be, as this has been, a joint process of continuous improvement, because these regulations are the baseline from which we will move forward. So we are involved in the range of policy areas that are brought into effect through these regulations, in identifying where adjustments, amendments, improvements, gaps that need to be filled exist. And this integrated framework that we're talking about does a lot of that based on the evidence that SEPA has brought forward over the years to the government to identify where improvements in regulation need to be made. So if I have characterised this as a passive journey, that's not the case, but what we are is a delivery agent. So yes, we're involved in putting forwards thinking and ideas about policy areas, about issues and impacts, and recommending other ways where they can be adjusted in the event that a decision is taken that a certain element will or will not go forwards. Yes, we can influence, but we are not the final decision maker. And I think what I'm trying to tease apart is our role in implementing what we have in front of us, but before that we have 10 years plus of exercises in identifying where improvements would be made. And they do come from the experience of the regulator and the evidence that we've built up and the challenges that we've faced. And therefore, here are the new tools which will help us address the challenges that we've had. I have no doubt that we will have more challenges in future, that we will seek to see further amendments or further changes made in regulation in due course as we build up the evidence piece to say this is a gap, or this is an issue, or this is a change that needs to be made. So if I've given the impression that we haven't had that intrinsic involvement in developing this work, I have downplayed my colleagues' work to almost a criminal extent, and that was not my intention. We are heavily embedded in this.
I'm actually very grateful for you putting that on the record. I don't think that was particularly teased out during the evidence session, but thank you very much.
Okay, we've slightly overshot our time. I'm going to keep my last question very, very simple, and it refers back to something I said earlier. And I'm looking at your evidence that you submitted to the committee. Just to remind you, it said that the wastewater and PCC regimes from 2025 will change, and leading this will be digital transformation. It slightly worries me that with less than a year away, you are talking about developing, creating, to try and deliver efficiencies in a computer system which I still stress that I think SEPA are struggling with. Can you set my mind at rest and convince me that you're going to be digitally ready by November 25?
To the best of my ability, yes. So we are identifying how best to engage with our customers in a user-friendly platform. We are following the principles of reuse what we have, if that's appropriate, before we buy, before we build something new, which that takes you down a hierarchy of the time that it can take in order to bring a new system into effect. So the principles that we are using are designed to bring us the benefits that we need in the shortest possible time.
Okay. I have to say, I'm less than convinced, and I think there's a huge amount of work to do as somebody who interacts with SEPA using the forms. They are not easy and they are not user-friendly, and there are lots of lessons that you could learn, in my opinion, from other organisations. Anyway, today we've looked at a 291-page SSI, which I think is probably pretty complicated, and I'm extremely grateful the government have given us more time to look at, because I think we'll need every moment of it, because I'm not sure I feel confident I'm much the wiser from today. But you I think, have offered various information, and you've offered information to Mark, which the committee would welcome as well. I think it would be inappropriate for him to FOI it when it's part of the committee business. And no doubt we'll get it quicker as a committee than we will through an FOI process. So I thank you for your evidence session this morning. And if I could ask committee members to be back here by 10:26, that would be perfect. Thank you very much. And I suspend the meeting. Welcome back. Our third item of business this morning is an evidence session on the Land Reform Scotland Bill. And today we're taking evidence on part 2 of the bill from a range of practitioners. I'm pleased to welcome Hamish Lean, partner of Head of Rural Property, Shepherd and Wedderburn, Martin Hall, as Senior Director of Davidson and Robertson, Tom Oates, a Director of Oates Rural, and Andrew Wood, a partner in residential development at Bidwells. Thank you all for accepting the invitation this morning. And I'm also pleased to welcome Rhoda Grant, who will have an opportunity to ask a few questions at the end. Just want to remind members that I have an interest in a farming partnership in Murray, as set out in my register of interest. Specifically, I declare an interest as an owner of approximately 500 acres of farmland, of which about 50 acres is of woodland. I also declare that I'm a tenant on approximately 500 acres in Murray on a non-agricultural tenancy, and I have another farming tenancy under the Agricultural Holding Scotland Act 1991. And I also take on grass lets occasionally on a short-term basis. I also should point out that in 2005 I was working with a company called Bidwells, and Andrew Wood is a member of Bidwells, and I knew him when I was working with him some almost 20 years ago. We're going to move straight on to questions in this section, and the first question is going to come from Monica.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to our panel. I want to begin by asking about the model lease for environmental purposes. So just to begin by asking the panel if, in your view, this serves a practical purpose, and if you can foresee any potential issues with the approach that's set out in the bill. Martin is looking directly at me, so would you like to go first, Martin?
Well, I think the model lease has the potential to do a good job for the sector. There's a couple of riders on that, though. I think, firstly, it's important that it falls out with the Agricultural Holdings Act, because there's an opportunity to conflict with the Agricultural Holdings Act tenancies. And I think the other part is just what comprises environmental purposes and how that works practically. Is it mainly environmental use? Is it wholly environmental use, or whatever? But overall, I think that it has the potential, and we would welcome an alternative vehicle to use for that purpose.
Thank you. Andrew?
I mean, I agree with Martin. I think the vital thing is keeping it separate from agricultural holdings. The difficulty will come where there is, a mixed use. That these properties are unlikely just to be environmental, and so you could have an element of agriculture, you could have an element of other commercial uses within the lease. But there will need to be sort of clear water between the two bits of legislation for it to be effective. So there will have to be, within the drafting, the ability to carry out certain agricultural operations. Grazing would be the obvious one in an environmental type structure. But other than that, I would welcome the opportunity to bring this forward. I don't know how often it'll be used, because I suspect we'll see that there are a lot of larger agricultural units that are already, deemed to be agriculture, doing environmental things, and whether you could split a holding and create a new area using this model, that would be something that people would probably consider as well.
Okay, and Tom?
No massive comment. The only thing I would say is, from a very practical angle, I think it's extremely confusing to have another type of lease on board. We're trying to split out agriculture and environmental, and really they are quite combined the same. If there's a specific environmental thing, it could be done with a commercial lease rather than having another type of lease involved. From the practical people on the ground, I think it's just another level of confusion.
Okay, and Hamish, do you have a different view, or do you agree with any of that?
I'd echo what the previous speakers have said. I wonder whether there'll be much in way of a practical uptake for this sort of lease. The bill contains provisions, for example, in relation to compensation for improvements which are tied to sustainable regenerative agriculture. So there is a question mark over whether the model lease is necessary, and I suspect that in reality there will be very few landlords and tenants who would be actively seeking this model out.
Okay. I wonder if anyone has a view on what's in the bill and what was previously consulted on, because there is a different approach now. Any comments on that? Or Martin?
Yeah, if I could go. We were favouring the former approach, for sure. You know, it gave a great deal more flexibility and scope, I suppose, for the sector to grasp the very different environment that we're working in now than we did 30 years ago. And so the number of uses that land can be put to within an agricultural, broadly agricultural business is important, that we have the tools there to be able to use. And we were seeing the land use tenancy as definitely a good vehicle for that. You know, that has now been moved towards an environmental use, and that's where I'm seeing the balance between the environmental use and other uses. It would be important to understand where the boundaries are.
Okay. Just a final question, then, Convener, on this part of the bill. You know, as we take evidence, we are, you know, looking to perhaps make suggested improvements to the bill, identify possible areas for amendment at a later stage. So, on this provision, is there anything that you would want to add in terms of whether this should remain in the bill, or does it need to be changed in any way? Sorry, Martin, putting you on the spot, but if anyone else wants to comment.
I would change it back to what was being discussed before the draft came out, to have a greater deal of flexibility around it, for sure.
Okay, that's helpful. Any final comments on that, Andrew?
I would support Martin. I also think that, you know, how often will this be used in practice? You know, I think we're creating quite a large piece of legislation that is probably rarely going to be used in practice. So, you know, the balance needs to be considered.
Okay, just a final point then to you, Andrew. I mean, if you believe it's not really going to be used in practice, is it really required at all? Is it serving a purpose?
Probably not.
Okay, does anyone disagree with that before I hand back to the convener?
Yeah, I disagree with that. I think it will be used. I think we need to move. We need to move forward as a sector, and I think this is an important flag towards that changing environment.
Okay, so we've got a range of views. Thank you, Convener.
Thanks very much. I forgot to say at the beginning, obviously when people are asking questions, it's quite difficult if every committee member asks every single person a question, say the same question. So if you want to come in, if you can catch the questioner's eye, and if you don't want to come in, look away. The problem is if you all look away at the same time, somebody will get called in. So it doesn't always work. And the other thing just to say is, if I think you're going a bit too long into the question, I'll give you a sign. That doesn't mean you look away and continue. So the next question comes from Kevin. Kevin, over to you.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. We heard from crofting stakeholders last week, and the Scottish Crofting Federation feel that small landholdings should be converted to crofts. What's your opinion of that? And would you like to see an expansion of the crofting counties? And Martin caught my eye there, first of all, so please.
Well, I feel quite strongly that I think the bill is heading in the right direction, that in the draft bill, that it's moved towards agricultural holdings rather than the crofting. I advise some small landholders, and they're generally in the lowlands of Scotland, and they just wouldn't fit with crofting. There are mixed units, and one in the Lothians, some in Dumfries and Galloway, and some further west. And there's at the moment there's a great deal of confusion about how to review rents, how to do certain things within those holdings, and I think aligning it with the agricultural holdings is a sensible move forward.
You said that you didn't think it would fit with crofting certain of these land holdings. Why do you think that's the case, please?
I think they operate already as broadly as agricultural holdings rather than as crofts, and that's really the basis for my answer.
Okay. Anyone else want to come in? Andrew, please.
There's a wide range of size of agricultural holdings already, right down to a few acres operating as agricultural holdings. So the way this has been drafted, it would fit well to carry on and bring in the small land holdings into the agricultural holdings legislation, because it would align them with many small farms that are, some of them are only a few acres, and bring them together, operating under the same legislative framework.
Okay. Anyone else on that point? No. Okay. You've kind of covered this, but the Faculty of Advocates suggested that from the point of view of legal clarity, it may be more helpful to wholly codify small land holdings legislation without leaving elements of the old legislation in force. Do you agree with the approach taken by the bill, or do you feel that another approach may have been preferable? And who wants to have a crack at that? Should we go to Hamish?
There are only about 50 to 60 small land holdings in Scotland, it's believed, and whether such a whole-scale codification could be justified for a relatively small number of holdings out there, I don't know. Broadly speaking, I welcome the provisions of the bill, essentially bringing small land holdings legislation up to date and more in line with agricultural holdings legislation, and extending the Tenant Farming Commissioner's functions to small land holdings. A whole-scale codification, I think, is probably unnecessary.
So that would be a sledgehammer to crack a nut?
Essentially.
Okay, thank you. Tom, please.
To be honest, having never dealt with small land holdings in 25 years, I'm not in a position to really comment.
Oh, I thought you waved there.
Oh, sorry.
Something to say.
I was looking away.
Andrew, please.
No, I was just agreeing with Hamish, really. There's so few of them. I think in 36 years I've tripped over one.
You've tripped over one in 36 years. Okay. Thank you very much, Convener.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm never quite sure we know quite how many there are. I think 50, I've heard 80. I haven't had any advance on that, but it seems to be quite a small number. Well, the next question comes from me, which is on the registration of tenants' right to buy. In 2003, on the first bit of land reform, we had a registration. 2016, if I remember, it was removed, but well, there was the ability to remove it, but it was never actually anything done about it. And then this bill is suggesting were they going to do something else. Is the bill right? And do we need to keep changing it or not changing it or suggesting we're going to change it? What's the simple way of doing this? Hamish, do you want to go on that?
The simplest way of doing it was as provided by the 2003 Act, where a secure agricultural tenant had to actively register a preemptive right to buy in the Register of Community Interests in Land in the agricultural section. That had the benefit of the agricultural tenant having to actually think about what it was they occupied under the secure tenancy, because a plan required to be lodged with the registration application. It also gave the opportunity to the landlord to challenge either the extent of the holding or whether or not a secure agricultural tenancy existed in the first place. It gave quite a lot of confidence to the market in respect of a purchaser buying a farm. One of the standard checks as part of due diligence would be to check the Register of Community Interest to see if a preemptive right to buy had been registered, and it prevented the situation which might otherwise have arisen, which is that a purchaser buys in good faith to find that a tenant appears out of the woodwork, as it were, to claim a secure tenancy over the ground that has just been purchased, bearing in mind that the tenant under the 2003 Act acquired an absolute right to buy if they hadn't been given an opportunity to exercise a preemptive right to buy. So that was always the problem that would have occurred if the need to pre-register had been removed. I don't know if that's the reason why that particular part of the 2016 Act was never brought into force, but it's welcome that that's not going to be brought into force. And there may well be changes that would be appropriate to the registration process, but first and foremost, I welcome the fact that registration will still be necessary.
Does anyone disagree with Hamish? Right, that's perfect. So leave well alone and move on at that stage, I think is the message I'm getting. Bob, the next question comes from you.
Yes, thanks, Convener. So I want to look at resumption within the bill. Now, my notes tell me this is one of the more contested aspects of the bill, so we'll find out in evidence this morning. Mr Hall, I think I saw that you were the National President of the Central Association of Agricultural Valuers, who thought it was maybe about time that compensation rights under resumption was reviewed. So would you agree in principle, maybe say a little bit more, Mr Hall, about whether you think it's right in principle to review some of this?
I think, yes, happy to do that. I think it's right in principle to review it. There's two parts to my answer, though. I think, firstly, in connection with 1991 Act tenancies, I think the mechanism has become out of kilter with the relinquishment and assignation. So that's the reason that I do think it's right to review the process. And you know, the draft bill takes steps towards that, although it needs tidying up because it looks clunky and cumbersome. The second element is to do with 2003 Act tenancies. I know there's been discussion within the sector through the TFAF and so on that the 2003 provisions shouldn't be changed, and I broadly agree with that. So, yes to 1991 Act, no to 2003 Act.
You've kind of almost preempted my second question, so we will come back to that so you can put that more clearly on the record. Hamish, I think you had some concerns about doing some of this stuff. Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Yes, and in two parts. First of all, the proposed changes in relation to secure agricultural tenancies. It's my experience and practice that, well, first of all, that resumption in relation to a secure agricultural tenancy is only possible where there's a written lease with an express provision within the lease that allows resumption to take place. And there are a surprising number of secure tenancies out there which exist by virtue of operation of law, so there's nothing in writing, and therefore no contractual right on the part of a landlord to resume land out of the tenancy. And in those circumstances, the tenant is in a very strong position to negotiate commercial terms in relation to agreeing the resumption or not. Even where a lease contains a resumption clause, there is a settled body of case law to the effect that if the resumption will be materially prejudicial to the viability of the remainder of the farm, the Land Court won't permit the resumption to take place. So resumption of a small, relatively unimportant part of the farm is reasonably straightforward, and the tenant is entitled to compensation by way of a reduction in rent, disturbance and reorganisation compensation, normally 5 times the rent reduction, compensation for any improvements. But the greater the scope of the proposed resumption, the easier it is for the tenant to challenge it. For example, a tenant on the edge of a town where half the farm was suitable for commercial or residential development, the resumption clause in the lease will not allow that resumption to take place because the tenant can oppose it because of the materially prejudicial effect on the remainder of the farm, in which case, if it happens at all, it's only on the basis that the tenant will be able to negotiate favourable terms. So the question mark that I have over the resumption provisions relating to 1991 Act tenancies is whether, in fact, they're necessary at all. The other observation in relation to fixed duration tenancies under the 2003 Act is that this is a powerful disincentive to landlords not to let out land if it's reasonably foreseeable that there is some development potential, because the 2003 Act, as it currently exists, allows a landlord under Section 17, if the landlord obtains planning permission, to serve a resumption notice on a 12-month notice period to take back whatever part of the land, or indeed the whole of the holding, which is subject to planning permission. A landlord who has land that they might otherwise have been prepared to let out, but which they might be developing part or all of it within the reasonably foreseeable future, isn't going to let that land out if the consequence is that they're going to have to pay the tenant a substantial amount of compensation for doing so. So they'll just avoid letting out land.
Okay, can I just, only because it's really important, it may be helpful to let you speak for longer, but I want to kind of keep the questioning moving. So I want to make sure I'm not misrepresenting you, Hamish. I think you're suggesting that by reviewing the compensation for tenants and resumption and changing it, it could theoretically weaken the position of some tenants, which would be an unintended consequence within the legislation. Is that, I'm not trying to summarise that as your entire position, but is that one of the aspects that you're maybe hinting at within what you were saying?
Certainly in relation to the availability of short limited duration tenancies and modern limited duration tenancies going forward.
Okay, that's helpful. And I will bring Will Witness in shortly, but Martin Hall, given that you've got a different view and you spoke relatively briefly in relation to reviewing some of this in principle, how would you respond to some of the concerns that Hamish has put on the record this morning?
I think broadly, I think I was. I think we're saying the same thing about the the different types of tenancy being treated differently. So we're aligned on that front. The other point that I didn't bring out earlier was that I think that the draft bill misses the incontestable notice to quit for the whole, which I believe was the original intention for this being reviewed, and it seems to have been missed altogether. In that we're dealing only with resumption, not with a whole farm situation, and it would fall out with this provision that's in the draft bill at the moment.
Do you think the bill should be dealing with that, Mr. Hall?
I do. Yes.
Okay, which is also why I
just clarify, because not everyone will understand. Just like clarity, incontestable notice to quit. Could you give grounds for where that would be served, just so we can understand that?
Yeah, absolutely. So where a landowner obtains planning permission for a whole farm for say residential development, he could serve what's called an incontestable notice to quit because of the alternative use for that farm, and there's very few grounds for objecting to that or fighting that, and very limited compensation payable.
So what you're saying, Mr. Hall, is that should be attended to. In other words, that should not be allowed to happen without more significant compensation for the tenant.
Yes.
I think all witnesses are nodding their head. Mr. Wood, are you also nodding your head?
I'll have my say in a minute.
You have your say in a minute. Well, at that point, let's move on. I think Hamish, Martin and Tom were certainly nodding their heads in relation to that point. I should bring Mr. Wood in first. In relation to, I think we've moved on to whether or not this should include notice to quit arrangements or not, and I think the panel so far have said it shouldn't include notice to quit. But that brings up to speed where we are with the line of questioning. Mr. Wood, what comments would you like to make?
If I just cover off the 2003 Act, it's hard enough to persuade a landlord to let any land at all at the moment. because of the frameworks that they would have to operate under. And further meddling with the 2003 Act, will just completely undermine confidence in using that legislation. So I would urge that you don't change that. We use it all the time as a method of letting land that potentially could come forward for development, and we build clauses. There's flexibility in the legislation to build clauses in that will allow for land to be released, and everybody is going into that knowing the situation at the start of the agreement. If you effectively retrospectively change the 2003 Act by introducing this, that will undermine the confidence of using that legislation significantly. The 1991 Act resumption provisions are needing updated. There are situations where the compensation is not appropriate in that generally people's costs have moved forward with inflation and change, and I'm not saying that it needs to change by a huge amount for taking back a small corner of a field for a road improvement, or selling a bit to the village hall or that sort of thing, but people's base costs have changed, and it can be out of kilter with that, and I think there needs to be a review of that process. The issue from a development point of view is much more tricky. I get involved in a lot of rural development, and the landlord often is on a 20 or 30-year journey of investment to bring forward land for development, and the tenant is not involved in that risk or the funding of that to get it to. If you want to do 10 affordable houses on the edge of a village or something like that, that could be completely blocked if we're not careful how we treat the revisions to the resumption legislation. So it needs further looking at in regard to that.
And can I just, before I bring Mr Oates in, can I just check then, because it's helpful, you're overlapping onto all the questions I want to ask in this area anyway. You've said this needs to be reviewed, Mr Wood, also in terms of I think within your answer you were saying that the time is right, not for fixed term tenancies, but in general to look at compensation for resumption because things have moved on. I was going to ask, I won't just regurgitate the model that I've got in my briefing notes, it gets quite complex. You've said there should be a review, Mr Wood. Are you willing to put on record how you think it should change?
I'll write to the committee with some proposals.
Okay, and that would genuinely be helpful. Mr Oates, you've been very patient. On all of the above, any comments and reflections?
Just to sort of clarify, wholly agree leaving the 2003 Act tenancies as they are. Going back there is going to revisit a mess there. In terms of compensation for the 91 Act, I'm wholly with Martin Hall on this point there. The agricultural tenant, from a practical point of view, loses his agricultural interest, i.e. his relinquishment and value. So I think that's where the compensation should move to. That's moving forward with the base costs of in line with what Mr Wood was saying as well. So it's increasing the compensation that's payable there. I strongly believe it should be ag value only that they should be compensated for. And one other thing on the resumption there is a suggestion of the involvement of the Tenant Farming Commissioner in this process. I think that is a complete red herring. I think there's no need to involve the TFC in this. A lot of these are done by negotiation over the kitchen table, and it removes the ability to have that negotiation if your immediate default is to the TFC to appoint an independent valuer. I think it actually is a bit of an insult to the industry as valuers and negotiators to remove us out of that position.
I think on this occasion Mr Wood was nodding his head in relation to that, which can be captured on the record. Mr Roach, you said, I'm nearly finished with this section. I want to kind of mop up the different views of witnesses. I think we have to reflect very carefully because it's quite a complex area within the legislation. You said, Mr Roach, that it was agricultural value only in relation to compensation in relation to resumption rights. I think Mr Wood was nodding his head in relation to that. Oh, right, he hasn't. Mr Wood, and then if there's any other views in relation to that, that would be helpful, Mr Wood.
No, I wouldn't go as far as saying you have to buy back the land from the tenant, which is...
It's under the ag value in terms of the relinquishment assignation value.
Well, I don't agree with that, actually. I think there's a middle way that recognises, small-scale resumptions.
And that's something you're going to write to the committee with your thoughts on. I'm going to bring everyone just one more cut at this, if that's okay, Convener, because I think it's quite an important part within the legislation. And Mr Lane was talking about unintended consequences of some of this stuff and how it might disincentivise landowners from leasing. So any further comments that you have, Hamish, in relation to any of that, and from what we've heard so far, so it's going to mop up, we've captured the views of all the witnesses in relation to this particular section, and then we're going to have to reflect on it as a committee. Hamish?
So, the thrust of the resumption proposals in the Reform Bill don't impact at all on the underlying ability of the landlord to resume or otherwise. It's all about compensation, so far as 1991 Act tenancies are concerned, and the greater the scope of the resumption in a 1991 Act tenancy, the greater the ability of the tenant to resist and negotiate commercial terms. There's nothing in the bill to suggest that that changes in any way. I would be concerned if there were any changes that would impact on the tenant's ability to contest the resumption.
Okay, thanks.
But there's nothing there at the moment.
That clarity is helpful. Mr Hall.
I just wanted to pick up on something that Tom Oates was saying and that he was alluding to, was the process that's outlined in the draft bill. It looks cumbersome, particularly for small resumptions, and that, yes, there needs to be a backstop position, absolutely, but for the majority of cases it should be a negotiated position to start with, and if all else fails then you revert to the process that's within the draft bill. I think that's all I
should that, does that need to be clear on
it does, I think, the bill? Well, as it's drafted at the moment is that the automatic first position is to refer it to the Tenant Farming Commissioner. The costs and the process involved in that is significant, and for things like someone mentioned an access or a garden extension or a village hall, that type of resumption of a small area, that the costs and process would be prohibitive for that to happen.
And your view, Martin, would be that if both parties can enter into a negotiation in good faith without having to recourse to that would be perfectly acceptable, but that's a fallback position.
Yes.
Right, okay, and the bill doesn't suggest that.
No, it doesn't.
Currently stands. I think we'll take Mr Wood and then finally Mr Oates, and that would be my quick questioning, Convener. Mr Wood.
I would just support what Martin says. I mean, that the majority of resumptions and surrenders are dealt with through negotiation perfectly, amicably, and a commercial position is agreed. Having to go to the Commissioner as the first point in any of these would be completely overkill in terms of what happens day to day. We do need that ability to refer on if things don't work. So the bill needs amended to say, in the event that agreement between the parties cannot be reached, then it can be referred to the Commissioner.
Okay, that's helpful. And Mr Oates?
Yeah, I'm in agreement with that there. Obviously, what Martin and Andrew have said there. First and foremost, it is negotiation, so but the backstop would be extremely helpful.
Okay, can I thank all four witnesses for helping me get my head around what is quite a complex area within the bill. I have no further questions at this time.
Just before I move on to the next question, just out of interest, if you're going to refer it to the Tenant Farming Commissioner, if it doesn't work out, it would be helpful to know what you think would be a reasonable time, because sometimes negotiations can become so protracted that there's never a solution. Would it be fair to say that if negotiations have not been resolved in 3 months or cannot be resolved within 3 months? I mean, I'm just thinking of a timescale to help people. Does anyone have a view on that? If you will look away, Hamish, do you want to?
I think that it wouldn't be helpful to have a delay built in. It should be open for either party to be able to go to the Tenant Farming Commissioner immediately if, in fact, this procedure is going to be introduced.
So if either party is unhappy, they could go to the Tenant Farming Commissioner at any stage. That's rather like not say don't go to negotiation, surely.
But then, if you're not minded to negotiate at all, then you just don't engage for the 3-month waiting period before the other side can go to the Tenant Farming Commissioner anyway. So I'm not sure that a built-in period to allow negotiation would actually work. And the procedure should be notice-driven, in my view.
Does anyone have a contrary view to that? No. Okay, right. The next question then questions actually come from Mark.
Yeah, thanks. Can I ask you about compensation for improvements and the shift from fixed lists to illustrative lists? Is that something that you back? And I understand that the illustrative lists now include improvements which are presumed to facilitate or enhance sustainable and regenerative agricultural production. Do you think the illustrative lists are clear enough? Are they workable? Would they be workable? Tom, you're kind of nodding, but
that's fine. I'll jump in first there. From review, I would say that the updated lists are required, so it has a more encompassing there. I don't feel there's necessarily a need for the new proposed Part 4. A lot of those are some practical things on the ground, but some of them are items that probably will not be of value to the incoming tenant as such. And I think it could be confusing to include some of the things that are identified within Part 4.
But certainly an example of that.
Sorry?
Do you have an example of that?
It was laying down of some pastures, or was it the old weaving of water meadows, which were included. And it's very much a new area, what it's trying to aim at, and it's guessing, and so therefore somewhat confusing as to what they may well be.
Okay. Any other views on that, Martin?
Yeah, broadly in agreement with what Tom's saying, that I think the overall principle of moving towards a general list rather than a prescriptive list is the right direction of travel. Mm-hmm. But with regards to Part 4, there's definitely scope for confusion within that. So Part 4 is to do with improvements to facilitate or enhance sustainable or regenerative agricultural production. And it looks like it's just been bolted on the back. And within that, there are elements that will require notice, and there are also elements that require consent, but it doesn't say which are which. So, for instance, the laying down of pasture may be a notice, the making of water meadows may be a consent, because that's changing the nature of the land altogether. Planting with trees might be a consent. There are different impacts on the land within that list, but it's not clear how they're to be dealt with. And I would think there will be room for disagreement and dispute within that if it's not clarified.
Okay, so more clarity would be useful. Is that
but
right?
also to move them. There's no reason why Part 4 actually needs to be there.
Right.
It could be within the other three parts of the.
Tom, do you want to come back briefly and then we'll move briefly?
Yes, very quickly. Can I say there, it's of this sustainable and regenerative farming. It's a bit of a buzzword. Is there an actual clear definition as to what that is? Because a lot of sustainable and regenerative practices are now common practice in productive farming. It's a way of utilising the soil, the natural goods, to be more productive with less cost. So that's practical farming. So is sustainable and regenerative there a bit of a nonsensical angle? Is there a clear definition? So therefore it is confusing as to what it is.
I suppose it depends how you value and monitor it. And if there's testing and soil testing and evaluation of biodiversity.
That could be good farming practice now.
Yeah, well, okay. Andrew?
I would support Tom. I mean, there's, if you go back in time, there's been sustainable farming going on forever, and it is it is a catchphrase at the moment, and there are some new husbandry methods that are coming forward that are flagged as sustainable and regenerative, but they are just farming. And I mean, most of Part 4 could easily sit in Part 3 and be drafted accordingly. There's not a clear definition. We're using words there that actually have no clear definition in as to what they are. So I think that needs some review.
Okay. Do you think there's a link here back into land management plans? Actually spelling out what those benefits will be, what the restoration, regeneration looks like and is monitorable?
Could be, yeah.
Okay.
Worth looking at.
Okay. Any other views? No? Okay, in which case I'll move on. So interested in your views on the diversification proposals. Are they clear enough? Will it make it easier for tenants to make environmental improvements, supplement their incomes through diversification? Any thoughts on that? No?
I suppose that the observation I had was that what will mostly motivate tenants looking to diversify is to generate additional income from their use of the holding. And it's not immediately obvious that pursuing a diversification to provide environmental benefit is directly going to benefit the tenant's pocket. So whilst I've no objection particularly to these provisions being introduced to diversification, I wonder whether or not that it will actually mean that tenants will be pursuing environmental schemes on their farms if there is no immediately obvious commercial benefit from them.
Okay. Any other views? Martin?
I don't have anything to add than other what's in the draft. You know, in the draft bill, I think it's a positive move generally.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks. The next question is from me. Just a yes or no answer from each of you would be helpful. Have any of you ever completed a compensation claim for game damage?
Yes.
One. How many have you done? Can I ask, Tom?
About a dozen.
And how's that been worked out on crop loss?
An absolute nightmare.
Okay. So, there's a section in this bit about compensation for game damage, which includes crops, fixed equipment, interestingly, and livestock and habitats. So I'm trying to work out in my mind the simple situation where a tenant rents some land and the next door neighbour has a forest who's nothing to do with the landlord and has a shed load of deer in the forest who pop over the fence and eat the tenant's crops and then pop back over the fence during daylight hours. So the landlord, who has no ability to really control them unless he spends from 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock in the morning out there shooting them, will be hit for the game damage. Is that what you think this bill will resolve?
Just to clarify, the game damage claims that I've done has been specifically for game, as in birds, damage there. And when I say it's been a nightmare, it's been very, very difficult to accurately assess how bad the damage is. And it goes far beyond really what you can see in front of your eye. To clarify, I haven't done any with regards to deer, and I know this isn't a huge, huge issue, and particularly with damage to fixed equipment where you get marauding deer coming through. For what it's worth, my thoughts would be is if the tenant has the ability to control the deer on the holding, not just the tenanted area, that would be a good move forward, because a lot of the control happens out with the area within the tenancy, and if the tenant can't control that. But I do appreciate that deer can come from neighbouring units,
So the fence, for example, if you follow convention, 50% would belong to the landlord and 50% would of the holding and 50% would belong to the neighbour. And so you're going to create a claim for both of them. I'm wondering how important this is in the bill and how relevant it is and whether it's going to make claiming for game damage easier.
I think it is highly relevant because the scale of damage with deer is enormous. And it's not just the external fences where you've got neighbouring, it's internal fences which can often lie with one or the other party, 100%. And it is a big issue. There are a relatively small number, but they are massively affected. Okay, so just a yes or no, do you think, not to you because you've given your opinion, Tom, but Martin, Hamish and Andrew, do you think this bit in the bill is relevant and important, and is there a way to improve what seems to be quite woolly drafting?
I welcome the... Sorry, this isn't a yes or no answer, Mr Convener, but I welcome the provisions about compensation for damage by game. Deer damage is an important problem, but it's not the only problem being caused to agricultural tenants by game. I have a number of clients who are agricultural tenants who are severely affected by pheasants, for example. Pheasant shoots which are grossly overstocked, and with pheasants not just eating crop, but coming into farmyards, littering and causing all sorts of nuisance and damage. I also have tenant clients who complain about the manner in which shoots are conducted, with drives going through fields which contain livestock, causing disturbance to livestock and so on. The existing provisions aren't really adequate to address those provisions or those problems. The provisions within the bill do give scope and an opportunity to agricultural tenants to make meaningful claims for damage that they've suffered as a result of irresponsible stocking levels, for example, in relation to pheasants, or the irresponsible exercise of sporting rights across the tenanted farm.
Thanks, Hamish. Interesting you say that, but I've never completed a claim. Martin?
Well, I've never dealt with a game claim, or game damage claim, so I'm speaking from a relatively inexperienced point of view. What I do understand is for deer damage that there are measures that Nature Scott have that they don't currently implement. So there's already a degree of solution there that could be used, which isn't currently being used.
Okay, and Andrew.
I've never done a claim. I've been involved in situations where there has been some game damage and the tenant has approached the landlord and it's been remedied and solutions have been found without any formal claims that being lodged. Personally, I think this goes too far because it starts to bring in people who potentially have no ability to control the situation to become liable. The deer one is the biggest situation. I'm not sure this is the right place for this bit of legislation to deal with deer. We've got lots of other legislation in place to deal with deer. I am very concerned about a complete right given to all tenants to immediately go and shoot deer without due process, without them engaging and communicating with the landlord. On many estates, there will be other people out shooting the deer. And so, we need to have that quality communication. We cannot have different people with overlapping rights shooting deer at the same time. That could end up in a very, very difficult situation. So I think this is in the wrong place. I think Nature Scott have the ability to intervene when there's a problem. On estates I've been involved with for many years, commuting deer is a major problem. we've had deer, because of the changes in environmental pressures on the high ground, red deer have been pushed down onto the low ground. We've got large populations of red deer on the low ground now, where we never used to have them before. And so we're seeing this becoming a much bigger issue on low ground arable farms, where historically it wasn't an issue. I would park this somewhere else personally, and I think that that those that are responsible for deer management should step in, and we need a process in place that makes sure we have responsible communication before others go shooting deer where there's overlapping rights.
Okay, thank you. And not all day, but all night as well, now with thermal sites. Tom.
Just to be clear, just the committee there, whilst in approximately a dozen claims, a number of those claims have been on the same estates on repeated claims where the estate or the landowner has been willing to come to the table and do something to recognise the damage. There have been a number of instances there of huge frustration where the tenant has been denied or was not able to get the landlord or the owner to the table to compensate. So echo what Hamish is saying, that there is a frustration that there are clients out there who have not been able to claim, and whilst I've done some claims, that has been a situation where that specific owner, estate, etc., was happy to come and do something.
If I could add one extra thing, and if this is to remain in the bill, I think it's important that the references to the land court to determine the amount of compensation. Now, it really needs a much quicker reaction if to assess the claim. It needs someone on the ground to actually see it there and then almost. Whereas if you're referring something to the land court, it could be months and months, if not longer than that, before these things are actually heard. And it looks like extra delay that doesn't need to be there.
And I agree with that, and sometimes it's difficult if I can imagine quantifying the claim, because you don't know whether the crop will germinate or not germinate as a result of it, and so sometimes you have to wait for harvest to see what the crop loss will be in order to quantify your claim. Anyway, I think interesting comments there. Douglas, I think you've got the next question.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. Moving on to the standard claim procedure within the bill now. So should the standard claims procedure that the bill sets out for WAGO apply to claims of all types and sizes? And is there sufficient flexibility in the procedure to take account of unforeseen circumstances? And we like to... Martin,
I'm happy to go first.
Yes.
I think the procedure set out doesn't take account of the need to assess various elements at the very end of the tenancy. The principle of front loading, I think, is generally a good one, but the timetable that's set out within the procedure is not practical for all elements, and it misses some things out of that. But for instance, assessing growing crops, assessing fodder, that needs to be done, if not on the day of the termination of the tenancy, as close as practically possible to that date. And there's dates within here about assessing elements 5 months ahead of the end of the tenancy. It's just isn't practical from that point of view.
So is it the timescale really is the key concern?
Timescales, looks to be unworkable.
Okay, Tom, do you want to come in?
I would agree entirely with what Martin says. I think from a practical point of view as well is that the end of a tenancy is not an easy situation. Quite often it's quite contentious. And what you're potentially doing is you're bringing things further 9 months forward there, is you're actually invigorating a dispute at an early stage. I agree there needs to be sort of long stop dates on things, but to bring things forward with that rigid timescale, I think is causing more problems and creating a bigger issue with it.
So if we're looking at this bill and ways to improve it, what would you recommend then that, for amendments that can actually make this workable? Is it just around the timescales, making it more compact at the end, or?
I think there's some practical angles there that the heads of terms could be agreed at certain dates. But I think, and what Martin says there, is a number of things that cannot be assessed until the end of tenancy actually comes about. Because some of the things included there will not be completed until the end of the tenancy. So, but agreeing what the heads of terms, the items of claim certainly agreed, and then a point after the end of the tenancy when those items or the quantum of those items should be clarified as well. So two-stage. One is the heads of terms, and the second is actually the calculations thereafter.
Okay, That's very helpful. Andrew, do you have a comment on this?
No, I would agree entirely, because even pulling together all the documentation and things takes some time, particularly in relation to the cropping and soil testing and all that sort of thing that has to be done as you roll up to the end of the tenancy. And it is in that last sort of weeks or months of the tenancy where you bring all the information together and you'd be able to inspect the property, inspect the crops, and know the condition of the buildings at that point in terms of pulling the claim together. I mean, for the committee's views, this is not something that happens every day. This is it's a pretty infrequent thing, ending of tenancies for a lot of us. And they're not all contentious. Mm-hmm. A lot of them are very amicable, where the tenant has decided he's retiring or going off to do something else, and you settle the claim in terms of the due process.
So is this too prescriptive then, or?
I think it is too prescriptive, particularly in relation to the timescales. Definitely.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Don, do you want to come back in? Sorry.
Yeah, but I could. Sorry, just in terms of the timescales, I think the timescale that is vitally important is the date by which it should be finalised and agreed post the tenancy. That should be narrowed down, because there are situations where tenants have left the holding and months, years later, they're still waiting to be compensated for, and the can has been kicked down the road. There needs to be a long stop date when it needs to be finalised, and that is within a relatively short period of time after the end of the tenancy.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Hamish, did you want anything to add on this?
Yes, I think the provisions are cumbersome. I think the standard claim procedure could only ever arise in waygoing situations if there's a necessity to give a notice in advance of the event. Because if you're reacting, for example, to a game damage issue, it would be impossible to give advance notice of that. So I think it could only apply to waygoing. But the procedure outlined in the bill, demanding a high level of information in the preliminary notice, which will most often be served by a tenant. In my view, it would be next to impossible for a tenant to be able to negotiate these provisions without engaging professional advice at a very early stage, and many tenants will be completely unaware of a statutory process to go through, and it's adding costs and adding burdens to the tenant. Speeding up the determination of claims post the end of the tenancy, I agree with Tom, that would be a very good idea, but I'm worried that the prescriptions within the bill, they're too prescriptive, they're unnecessary, and they will make it more rather than less difficult for tenants to be able to negotiate or navigate their way through waygoing claims at the end of the tenancy.
But does it offer some protection for tenants?
I'm not sure that it does, because a tenant at the moment is able to make waygoing claims by service of a notice, a much simpler notice than is provided for in the bill. The legislation at the moment provides timescales, albeit quite long timescales, for the parties to attempt to agree their differences, and then the thing will end up in the land court. There's nothing in the bill that would stop a dispute between the landlord and the tenant about whether or not something should be compensated for or what the value is. There's nothing in the bill that would stop that dispute ending up in the land court anyway.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Just a question, maybe it's a unique Highland thing, but sheep are often hefted to a hill and form part of a waygo compensation because they know their way round. And if you've got a waygo in November, the ram may have been out with them, but you have no idea whether they're in lamb or not because you haven't got them back in. In fact, you probably at that stage don't know how many you've got anyway because they could have wandered all over the country, making timescales very prescriptive. Is that a fair comment? And would it cause problems? Tom, you want to...
Yeah, I mean, having done a number of sheepstock valuations myself, I think in reality what happens in practice is the parties will come to an agreement regarding when tubs are to be released, and the valuation for sheepstock may be brought forward to, say, 1st of November, prior to tubs going out, or in fact a lot of the tenancy agreements have stated in there that the landlord or the incoming tenant has the ability to release their own tubs onto the sheepstock prior to valuation. So, but the practical angle is the parties will come together and work through what a sensible solution would be.
But not 5 months in advance, perhaps?
No, 5 months in advance is way. It's again, practically, there's no way you could do a hill sheep valuation in August. Quite simply, your comparable evidence of your draft use sales, the draft use sales haven't happened.
And you won't know whether your use are going into the period of having the rams in perfect condition, so the landlord's in somebody else's hand if he's going to buy them. So there are problems, is what you're saying.
Well, the potential are problems, but it's in both landlord and tenant's interest, or the landlord or incoming tenant and the outgoing tenant, to make sure that process is dealt with as smoothly as possible, because it's in everybody's interest.
Well, everyone then gets value for money, surely.
Agreed.
Okay, perfect. The next questions come from the Deputy Convener, Michael Matheson. Michael.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. The 2016 Land Reform Act made provision for changes to the rent review process that were never fully implemented. By and large, from what we can see in evidence, is that the process was viewed as being unworkable. The bill now proposes some changes to the rent review process. Is it, in your view, is this process more workable than what was in place previously?
So perhaps I could pick that one up and run with it. Certainly the provisions in the 2016 Act, I feel I have to take some responsibility for, because I was a member of the Ag Holdings Review Group, which led to the Ag Holdings provisions entering the 2016 Act to begin with. And the group did recommend a productive capacity test. And then I was a member of the working group which tried to actually work out a productive capacity test, and it proved to be unworkable in practice. So I welcome the changes in the bill to the rent review procedure. I think that it balances a number of competing factors without setting out a hierarchy for doing so, which will take into account the productive capacity of the holding and so on, but also rent on similar holdings and prevailing economic conditions in the sectors of agriculture relevant to the holdings. So generally speaking, my overview about the rent review provisions is that they are workable and they will represent an improvement to the sector.
Michael, I'm looking across for you to see if there's anyone shaking their head. Tom's nodded his head, so I'm assuming that's agreement.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with Hamish's point. The one point I would like to make, though, is that I'm slightly concerned about the statement productive capacity of the holding. Production is only one part of it. That is the output, not the profit. And you can ramp up the output, and there are occasions where landlords will look simply at the output and then try and charge a percentage of output as a rent. And I think that's a very dangerous situation, because output is not real.
Martin, I think, do you want to add something to that, or you were just looking away?
No, well, no, I don't really want to add anything. I think Tom makes a fair point, and there may be scope to look at earning potential or some other words around that. But in principle, what Hamish and Tom both said I'm aligned with. There's a couple of practical things that I think the committee should take account of. The first one is there's a new definition being introduced in here in the fair rent. Now that is a new term, and that's not well understood within the agricultural sector. and we need to better understand that term, I think, what that actually means. And the second element is that the proposed amended wording for rent reviews has omitted to adopt some of what is already within the Act, which are, when you're looking at comparable holdings, what the disregards are for looking at those holdings. And that seems to be missed altogether here. And that should, in my view, be put back in.
Andrew.
I would agree with Martin on that. We should be mirroring some of the wording that's in the previous legislation. I have no idea what fair rent means in terms of this legislation. The difficulty in terms of earning potential and productive capacity is you can inspect the farm, you can take the grade of land, and you're assessing it on that basis in terms of what you think, if it's well farmed, can deliver. Not all farms are as well farmed as the one next door, or vice versa. So you have to take all of these factors into account. It's not straightforward, and certainly comparable evidence is vital in terms of assessing what the appropriate rent should be. And some of the things we've touched on earlier about diversification, again, that's going to fall into this in terms of what is actually happening in terms of earnings on the farm as well. So all of these factors have to be taken into account.
Sorry, Michael, back to you.
Thanks, Convener. That's helpful. I'm not too sure whether Martin Hall was making reference to this in his own comments, but the existing draft within the bill doesn't make provision for that they cannot charge for tenants' improvements. Is that a provision you think should be introduced into this particular part of the bill, given that it's in the original 1991 Act?
Well, under Section 13, there are things that you take account of and things that you don't take account of when you're looking at and comparing holdings. And that seems, in my understanding, is that has been missed out here.
And your view is it should be included?
It should be included, yes.
Okay, thanks. Can I turn to another part of the bill, which is in relation to the changes in the rules around good husbandry and good estate management? Now, I think in his contribution, Mr Oates made reference to the issue about sustainability and regenerative practices and how they can be quite difficult to define. One of the aspects that this bill is looking to amend is changing the rules around it, which makes specific reference to sustainability and regenerative agriculture. Do you think that there's that they've got taken the right approach in the changing around these rules? And is there anything in it you think could be further improved to give greater clarity?
The only person looking at you, Michael, is Andrew, so I'll bring him in and then we'll see what everyone else says.
It's an incredibly subjective thing, trying to define what good husbandry is. And I think all of us practitioners have struggled with this for many years, and it particularly comes into play where it's quite obvious where there isn't good husbandry being carried out. But how you define that and how you encourage those issues to be resolved is previous legislation has never really cracked that nut. I don't think this does either, particularly. And certainly something it's worth exploring further, but it's such a difficult thing to define because usually if there isn't good husbandry, it's a multifaceted thing. It's whether the livestock are cared for properly, it's whether the grass is managed properly, it's whether the fences are upright or whether they're all hanging loose, it's whether the drains are cleaned, it's whether the buildings are painted in terms of the terms of the lease. So, it's all of those things, and it's an extremely difficult thing to deal with in a practical context. So that I think this is something we need to certainly continue to discuss. I'm not sure this quite gets it.
The importance of the rules of good husbandry in practical terms in questions between landlords and tenants is that a landlord has a right to apply to the Land Court for a certificate that the tenant isn't practising good husbandry. And if the Land Court agree, the court issues what's called a certificate of bad husbandry. And if it does that, the landlord's then in a position to serve an incontestable notice to quit. So the rules of good husbandry are in no way esoteric. They have actual real effects in the real world. The proposals to change the rules of good husbandry are quite modest in scope. They change the definition of efficient to farming in a sustainable and regenerative way. It adds, for example, health and welfare of livestock. So those changes in and of themselves, I think, are straightforward and welcome. I have been involved in a case where, on one view, the tenant was guilty of bad husbandry, but in the other view, he was practising sustainable and regenerative agriculture. And if we are moving to a situation where we are encouraging or attempting to encourage tenants to farm in a way that is sustainable and regenerative for the benefits of the wider environment, then I think this change to the rules of good husbandry is welcome, because it would allow them to do so without being at risk of being challenged on bad husbandry in respect of a set of rules promulgated at the end of the Second World War, when the circumstances in society were very, very different indeed.
Michael, you've got Andrew wanting to come in. Can I just ask, when you're answering, could anyone say whether they've ever had a certificate of bad husbandry issued to the, or applied for and issued to them in relation? Hamish, you've 1, 2, 3.
Over the course of my career, I couldn't quantify them, but a number of issues.
Okay, Andrew, sorry.
I just thought it would be helpful in the context of what Hamish said to give an example, because many older leases quite specifically require the tenant to do certain things that would be deemed to be good husbandry, like removal of gorse and management of wetlands to make sure they're drained, etc., etc. And obviously nowadays that's completely against the rules of the sort of conservation approach. So just for the committee's knowledge, that there's still many leases out there that have those historic clauses in them, but nowadays you would be considered that was not the appropriate act to be doing, and even improving the land now is it can be contentious in some cases, and many leases still have that as an absolute requirement. So that we're framing it in that context.
Does anyone else want to come in? Michael, they're all looking away. Do you have a further question?
No, I'll hand back to you, Convener. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Bob, you wanted to ask a specific question, and then I'm going to go to Rhoda.
Thanks, Convener. A little bit of knowledge can be a dangerous thing in relation to this. I was just trying to find out a little bit more about fixed-term tenancies, and my notes didn't tell me there was short, limited duration tenancies, maximum 5 years. That could be converted to limited duration tenancies, minimum of maximum of 5 years to a minimum of 10 years, and then on to a modern limited duration tenancy. So it got me to think, from the 2003 Act onwards, could be a custom practice where a short-term tenancy is no such thing, but the tenancy dribbles on by custom and practice or by arrangement for 10, 15, 20 years. And if that is the situation, do we have to look at it again in terms of whether WIGO is fit for purpose, or perhaps resumption should be considered? Because that just seems... I'm just being a daft laddie here, Hamish. I'm just wondering, that would seem to be a wee bitty different.
So this, I think the industry would say is a vexed problem, because the 2003 Act introduced short limited duration tenancies up to a maximum period of 5 years and limited duration tenancies which had a minimum term of 10 years and longer. In 2011, regulations were introduced which, I'm sorry, the limited duration tenancy introduced in 2003 was for a minimum period of 15 years, and then that was pulled back to 10 years in 2011. The 2016 Act introduced a modern limited duration tenancy, which was in essence a variation on the limited duration tenancy, with some additional rights given to tenants. But that modern limited duration tenancy is also for 10 years. And accordingly, the choice to landlords at the moment is either to grant a short limited duration tenancy of up to 5 years or a modern limited duration tenancy of 10 years or longer. If a short limited duration tenant remains in occupation after 5 years and the landlord does nothing about it, then that becomes a modern limited duration tenancy of 10 years, backdated to the original start date. If a tenant in a modern limited duration tenancy remains beyond the expiry date and the landlord hasn't terminated it by a double notice procedure, the provisions are really quite complex, then there's an automatic 7-year continuation kicks in. Prior to 2016 in the Land Reform Bill, the default provisions for a limited duration tenancy had a cycle of continuations of 3 years and 3 years and then 10 years. There is a real problem out there in the real world trying to work out quite often on what basis a tenant is actually occupying the ground. And it's been a problem that I've wrestled with in the Land Court, and which the Land Court has made numerous decisions about. So there's no escaping the fact that those provisions are unduly complex, and there must be scope for simplification.
So I suppose I would just ask whether this bill could be a vehicle for that. And I suppose it could be, Hamish, but also that I'm just thinking if there's tenants out there who have got rights dating to the 2003 Act, we're now in 2024, 10 years passes, 2034, there could be tenants out there who have effectively been farming land for 30 years that might, another committee in 10 years' time might think they should have full resumption protection and rights. I'm just wondering, any reflections on that, Hamish?
I doubt that there's any time or scope to introduce significant reform into this bill, because it is such a complicated area which would demand a great deal of consultation to arrive at provisions. This was one of the most difficult issues of the 2003 Act when fixed duration tenancies were introduced, and why we have this odd situation of up to 5 and now 10 years and longer.
Okay. With the convener's permission, because it was meant to be a very brief question, I was asking Tom Oates if that's permissible.
Could I just say, actually, that the resumption, okay, the point is, with a Secure 91 Act, okay, there is a clear line of succession, okay, so when you're resuming, you're losing the ability to have that going forward. With a fixed term, albeit there's extensions, etc., there's a short period of time for which the tenant will have that land available to him. So the resumption compensation for the 91 Act is potentially dealing with generations in advance, going down the line, whereas a fixed term is a relatively short term. There are some longer term LDTs out there, but there's not that many to my knowledge.
Okay, that's helpful. If the convener permits, Andrew Wood.
Bob, I think you've understood just how complex it is from Hamish's answer. There is a real issue about confidence in terms of letting land.
Come to in a minute, so
I will then shut up.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for cutting your answer short, Andrew, so you didn't preempt my question. Rhoda, you'd like to ask some questions, I think.
Yes, please. Most of them are reflecting on some of what we've heard this morning. My first question really to Martin Hall. When you were talking about crofting and small holdings, you said that they were intrinsically different. I know certainly the legislation is, but the practice and what happens on that land doesn't appear to me to be different. You seem to suggest it might be.
Not particularly, but I think generally they're out with the crofting counties. I suppose they're operating often in the same way that an agricultural holding operates, and so that was the reason for my views on that matter. I don't deal specifically with crofting personally, so less of a working knowledge of that.
Okay. And I suppose what I'm thinking is crofting is an agricultural holding. It's just got different legislation. And I was trying to, I suppose, find out if there was something that was different happening on small holdings south that might not be something I was aware of.
Well, it would be largely agricultural activity that takes place on both, I imagine.
Okay, so they're similar, other than the legislation, obviously. Can I also just push you a wee bit further on the different leases, the environmental lease, and we've had discussion about how current leases in place at the moment may be working against environmental good practice, which might not be seen as good husbandry either. And is there a way in the bill, rather than create a different lease, is there a way in the bill to, I suppose, reflect back to changing circumstances for all leases? So we could have one lease that, I guess, covers good environmental practice and sees that as good husbandry, and kind of everybody. I'm kind of thinking that agricultural funding is going to reflect much more about how you look after the total area. So is there an opportunity in the bill, rather than to create two separate leases, to kind of bring that together and have that reflect back on current leases?
If I can, I think we need to be very careful here, is that I think it should be acknowledged that good farming practice at the moment, good profitable farming practice, involves care of the land, sustainable and actually regenerative farming as it is. I think we need to be very careful to try and split the two things apart. A lot of people now are, farmers are farmers, they care for the land, they're doing a good job. And try and create leases for new environmental practices, which actually is just evolving farming. Are we trying to sort of split the thing, whereas actually we're all channeling down one line? It's agriculture, and it's all involved in agriculture. Just these buzzwords about sustainable regenerative there are potentially dangerous, because that's just agriculture, and it's moving things forward.
Okay, and certainly the new agriculture bill looks at sustainable and regenerative farming as part of what subsidies will be based on, and there will be information coming out on that. But I just wonder if the environmental leases are more geared towards things that we see like carbon offsetting. Is that their purpose? And if that's the case, does that bind the landowner and indeed subsequent tenants to carry out that? So if you, I suppose my concern is that people sequestrate carbon in order to offset carbon generation elsewhere. And I wonder if those environmental leases could create an issue where somebody has bought 100 years worth of forestry on land or something like that to offset their carbon elsewhere. And could these leases be abused to do that? Everyone's looking at me very puzzled.
No, Rhoda, it's a question we've asked before, and whether a tenant has a right to sell off the carbon credits and therefore bind the landowner's hands indefinitely on what can be done with the land, and the whole issue of carbon credits. I think is something we're struggling with. So if anyone has any views, Tom's shaking his head. I think he wants to stay away from carbon credits like everyone else does at the moment. Does anyone have any views on that? Andrew, sorry, Reda, I jumped in.
Well, I think if the tenant was to sell something that was, should say, linked to the holding, then he might find that he has a claim situation. But we're getting into the... I mean, if you go back in time, some of us have been around long enough to remember the problems with milk quotas that were transferable caused and similar issues. So, you know, I would be inclined to try and keep them parked. And, you know, one party selling them when they shouldn't could be difficult. Can I just go back to the environmental lease question as well? Because, you know, we have the ability to have freedom of contract. You know, we can have a commercial lease that deals with these issues, and that can be drawn up by eminent lawyers, I'm sure, you know, that says exactly what is needed on the tin in terms of whether it's for forestry production or other things. And these leases do exist. There are forestry leases that include other environmental factors within them. So the question is whether we actually need this when we can use other ways of specific contracts for specific situations. That should be considered as well.
Andrew, if I could come in there, I think the difficulty with that, with what you're describing, though, those leases, those commercial contracts for environmental or tree planting, whatever, you can't undertake agricultural activity on that. Otherwise, they fall into agricultural holdings, and that's the difficulty here. And that's what we're identifying as a potential need out there for, you know, to avoid that from happening. So that it's a vehicle that can be used largely for environmental purposes. But by doing some agricultural activity isn't going to default it into a set of rules that isn't intended when the lease was entered into.
So there may be a place for this, but maybe not quite as drafted. Needs to be tidied up a little to make sure that some agricultural work can be carried out at the same time as environmental work.
But that it falls out with the agricultural holdings, and I think the draft bill allows for Parliament to produce a model agreement, so that they have a period of time to do that. I think there's a bit more work required on that to get there.
I mean, the environmental lease might allow a tenant to unlock sources of funding and investment to carry out environmental activities, but a funder in those circumstances will be looking at the terms of the lease and, more fundamentally, the length of the lease to ascertain whether it would actually be justifiable making an investment and providing the tenant with funds to carry out an activity. Because the investor would need to know, I think, that whatever environmental benefit would continue beyond the end of the environmental lease, because, of course, the landlord isn't bound to continue whatever it was that the tenant was doing for environmental purposes. So I'm not sure it would be it would be easy for tenants certainly couldn't sell carbon credits in a lease of this nature.
Okay, thank you.
So I get the last question as convener. It's a very simple one. And I'm going to try and encourage you to give a yes-no answer to it. You've all been very reticent about doing that for very good reasons. So my simple question is, I guess the majority of parliamentarians and people involved in the sector want to see more tenants coming into agriculture and increase the tenanted farm sector. Is this bill going to do it? Hamish.
Thank you, convener.
Yes or no?
No, on its own, no.
Okay. Martin.
Largely, I think it depends on the land use tenancy. If that was able to be introduced, I think that would make a significant difference. But without it, no.
So sorry, I didn't catch the last bit.
Without it, no.
Tom.
No, I think your bigger driver's tax.
Okay, Andrew.
No.
Okay, perfect. No, you don't get a second chance. If you say no, first of all, you should have come out with the first bit first and no at the end. You didn't do that. Thanks very much for giving evidence this morning. Really helpful as we are going through this bill, and I appreciate you coming into the committee this morning to help us with our deliberations. So we are going to move into private session, for which we'll move on to now. Thank you very much.